Hello and welcome to my channel. This is a story of what if Deku had earthed Quirk. It began with a glowing child. It didn't get better from there. With the sudden emergence of superpowers, life as we knew it was lost. The world changed, society upheaved, and chaos ruled. And as in all chaos, there rose those who would profit from it, carving chunks of land and people for their own. Like the warring kingdoms of old, those with power fought against those with power for money, for territory, for supplies or for the thrill. And as always, those weaker, those without true power, suffered for it. But as it always is, as it always had been and will be, those with power of their own, determined to bring order back to the world, ascended to fight in the name of the innocent. With wills of steel and the hope of the downtrodden, they overthrew the warlords and brought civilization back. But not as it was before. It couldn't be. It became a world of the different, the strange. But what once was inconceivable, inhuman, became accepted, normal. Expected, even. It became just another quirk of humanity's existence. And life went on. Those with the greatest power rose above the rest, becoming beacons of hope and pillars of order, bringing with them an era of scientific advancement, a celebrity culture of professional heroes, peace, safety and stability. As well as a hierarchy of power. Those with the strongest of abilities were lauded and praised. Those without are demeaned. Every child grows up wishing to join the ranks of heroes. Some, bolstered by the teachings of the previous generation, rocket to heights once thought impossible. Many more fail, but nothing lasts forever. Unheard and unseen, a storm gathers and thrashes, upheaval hidden beyond the horizon. Chaos is coming once again. As it always has. As it always will. That is the truth. But equally true is this. The greatest changes, for good or for ill, begin with the smallest of actions. The hurricane is formed from the delicate flutter of the butterfly's wings. The avalanche descends from the echo of the bird's call. Society is burnt to the bones lit by the glow of a child emerging from the womb. And all it takes to shake the world, is the right pebble, in the right place, at the right time. Ellipsis. It started on a random playground in Japan, no different from any other except for who was there that day. One was Bakugo Katsuki, proudly displaying an open palm to show off her newly discovered quirk, the ability to ignite her sweat. At the moment it was only a small flash and pop, but visions of earth-shattering kabooms and mushroom clouds danced in her head. Wow! The other kids cheered, none louder than her friend, Midoriya Izuku. That's so cool, Kachan. Much like their mothers, the two of them were a study in contrasts. Bakugo had pale blonde hair that spiked. Midoriya had fluffy dark green. She had ruby red eyes that, even at 4, held a sharp, taunting edge. His eyes were a soft green and couldn't be any more wide and innocent if he tried. Her skin, like her mother's, was on the darker side and flawless. His skin was like his mother's, on the paler side and sprinkled with freckles. She knew what her quirk was. He did not. You're damn right it's cool, she crowed, holding her hand up as more little flashes popped on her palm. I'm gonna explode so many bad guys they'll make me hero number 1. Hey, if you think that's cool, look what I can do. Another kid shouted, waving his arms for attention before taking a deep breath, his cheeks and throat bulging out like a frog. Then he spat a small vortex of wind directly at the group of kids. Let it be known that kids aren't the smartest at the best of times. Adding superpowers to the mix only made it worse, hence why quirk regulations were strict, especially in public and especially for kids. Katsuki, showing a startling amount of instinct, dove aside. The other kids, showing a startling amount of common sense, followed her. Izuku stood directly in the path, eyes sparkling. Oh, that's cool. It hit him directly in the chest. Luckily, it was rather weak and only sent him skidding back in the gravel of the playground. There was a second of stunned silence, the kind that comes when a little kid smacks their head on a table or face plants, a second where everyone holds their breath to see if the kid would start bawling or not. Slightly dazed, Izuku sat up, rubbing his chest, large green eyes watering. You're right, he told little Mr. Wind Spitter with a shaky smile. That is cool. Katsuki rushed over to his side, snarling at the other kid. What the hell, dumbass? Who just shoots their quirk at people? She turned to Izuku, with worry written on her face. You okay, Zuku? Are you gonna cry like a big baby? Izuku sniffled and said, No, then wiped his cheek with his hand. And gasped in pain. I knew it, Katsuki crowed, her face a contradiction to her words as she was already standing to go look for their parents, only for Izuku to grab her arm. What? You need to hold my hand. Kachan, look, the boy murmured, holding up his hand. There was gravel stuck to his skin, but luckily no blood. Yeah, you got rocks on you, Kachan dismissed, even as her eyes were glued to the sight and her fingers wrapped around his protectively. So what? Look, he urged, then made a face. After a second, she was just opening her mouth when the gravel stuck to his skin lifted off and began to gently orbit his hand. I have a quirk. So what? You can move pebbles. Big deal, Katsuki whispered, sharp red eyes tracking the rocks as they glided above his flesh. She blinked and looked away, finding the huddle of parents in the distance and put her lungs to work. Hey, old people, ellipsis. Coincidentally, the parents had just been talking about their kids' quirks, so they rushed over at the shout. Upon seeing the activation of a new one, they gave the two their congratulations right before Izuku's mother, Midoriya Inko, bundled him into the car and drove them towards the Office of In-Depth Quirk Investigation. And she only had to pull over twice to wipe her happy tears away. At the office, Izuku was pushed through a large battery of tests, first to determine what type of quirk, then once that was narrowed down, how strong it was, what it could affect and how long it could last. After a rather tiring 3 hours, Izuku sat in his mother's lap, clutching her arm and wishing he'd been able to bring along his favorite All Might action figure as the doctor slowly went through the pages of information previously gathered. He clicked a pen, circled something and adjusted his glasses before looking up at the pair. So, Midoriya Izuku, he spoke carefully and concisely, like every word was being recorded for quality purposes. After several tests, we have determined that your quirk is an emitter type, which can only affect rocks no more than 3 inches wide or long, in a telekinetic field that emanates no more than 2 inches from the skin on your body. It has been designated as rock field. He stopped, flipped the pages closed and set the clipboard down on his desk. That's it. Inko blinked, holding her son. Hearing it described as such, it sounded like a more concentrated, focused version of her own quirk, attraction of small things, but one that only worked on pebbles and gravel. Part of her was relieved. As far as quirks went, it wasn't impressive, and Izuku, like almost all kids his age, wanted to use their quirks to become famous, powerful pro-heroes. Which was, by the nature of the work and the world they lived in, extremely dangerous. On the other hand, she felt guilty about feeling happy that such a lacking quirk would make it nearly impossible for her little boy to get into such a perilous line of work. And a deeper, smaller part was very glad that she wouldn't be the one to break Izuku's fluffy little heart. Doctor, Izuku asked in his sweet, childish voice, do you think that my quirk, can I be a hero with it? The doctor sniffed, looked through the pages again, then blinked at the boy. As far as hero careers go, a quirk like yours would be almost entirely useless, he stated with zero tact. Inko squeezed her boy as he gave a hurt gasp. It isn't all bad. Many people, like your mother, have quirks lacking in power, but with some small niche uses. And, of course, it's better than being quirkless. Izuku blinked his large, watery green eyes, and let out a tiny, oh. And then he hugged his mother's arms. Thank you for your time, doctor, Inko said tersely, guilt and relief warring in her chest as she stood up and carried her son from the office. He remained quiet even as they left the building and she secured him in his car seat. It was only half an hour later that he spoke. He wasn't right, all right, Mom? He asked shakily, and she could see him playing with the buckle of his car seat in the rear view mirror, peering up at her through thick lashes, eyes rimmed with tears, shining with the pure hope that his mom would be able to make everything better with her words. I can still use my Q quirk to be a hero, all right. Inko looked at the road and swallowed hard, licking her lips. Izuku. She couldn't find the words. Like the doctor said, it's not all bad, right? There are other jobs, safer ones. Maybe you're meant for something more than hero work, honey. She chanced to look in the mirror and felt her heart seize. Izuku was staring at her in horrified silence, tears running from his eyes. He'd recognized what she was trying to do and he'd seen right through it. And it had shattered his little heart. His voice, when he spoke, was infinitesimally small. Okay, Mom. She blinked hard and tried to focus on driving, her throat feeling tight. It'll be all right, okay Izuku. How about when we get home, I make us tonkatsu pork, your favorite. How does that sound, sweetie? He didn't look up from his lap. Okay. It was only that she was driving did Inko restrain herself from closing her eyes and letting herself drown in her guilt and grief. Ellipsis. Eventually, Izuku's good nature won over his heartbreak, and he returned to his normal, cheerful self. Some might have said it was a hunger born from envy that he developed a hobby, a talent devoted to watching the fights of heroes, to examining and breaking down their quirks in his mind and, once it was overwhelmed, many notebooks. Others would say it was his natural mental state, to see things and automatically take them apart and figure out how they worked, how they could be used differently and how they could combine with others. And when the current crop of heroes had filled his pages, he turned an eye to his classmates and his best friend, Katsuki. Their quirks, how they could develop over time and generally just how cool he found her led to Katsuki's potential covering many pages. He noticed with some envy that with age, her explosions became more powerful and with training, more focused. And there was only more room for her to grow. For him, though, it was hopeless. He spent hours a day holding rocks in his field, having them orbit his body in increasing numbers and speed. Eventually, he managed to move them around his body faster. That was it. He tried to think of a way to use his quirk as a hero, perhaps covering himself in pebbles, spinning them at high speeds and then throwing them. The problem with that, though, became obvious the first time he tried such a thing on a crude target painted on a tree. At point blank, the rocks could actually do some damage. Outside of his field, however, the rocks lost velocity quickly and became just a tossed handful of gravel. And no matter how hard he tried, his field simply wouldn't extend, not even a millimeter. That was a blow to his battered hope of heroism. The next, most devastating blow, came when he was 8. During recess, he, Katsuki and some of their friends were exploring in the nearby copse of trees. The others had pulled ahead, crossing a fallen tree over a small stream, leaving the two to mosey at their own pace. The explosive blonde hopped onto the log without a care, practically stomping her way across it. Izuku was more tentative, carefully measuring his steps. She, eventually, slipped on a wet patch and tumbled into the stream with a cry, landing hard on her back. Blinking in the light of the sun streaming through the leaves, Izuku stood above her, offering his hand with a smile. "You okay, Kachan?" "I'm fine," she grumbled, taking his hand and pulling herself up. "I don't need your help, Zuku." Yeah, that hadn't changed in 4 years. Remember what All Might says. Izuku chirped with a smile, holding a finger up like an instructor. Even heroes need a helping hand once in a while. And whenever Queen Explosion Murder needs a hand, her best friend and partner Shrapnel will be there. He mimed an explosion with his hands and gave her a bright smile. It was so adorable. Katsuki felt her lips twitching upwards into a smile, red eyes subtly sparkling with humor, and then it left, and her lips flattened. "All Might never needs a hand," she muttered, still looking at him but speaking to herself. "Well, of course not." The green-haired boy smiled, posing like the #1 pro hero. "He's All Might, the greatest hero." Her brows furrowed in thought. "I'm gonna be the greatest." Her mind raced, images flashing through her head. Izuku blinked. Yeah, he couldn't shake the feeling of something bad coming his way. Her eyes turned back to him and narrowed into a glare. "All Might doesn't need help. I don't need help." He gulped under the intensity of her gaze. Well, I mean, Sir Night Eye helped him, as a sidekick, and a partner." Her visage remained unchanging. Kachan. That seemed to be the final straw, and she snapped. "Don't call me that." Izuku stepped back, hurt filling his features. Kachan. "What?" I said. She stepped into his space and shoved him back. "Don't call me that, damn it." Katsuki, what's wrong?" He panicked, eyes darting around her face, his hands worrying at each other. Did I do something?" "You're useless, Izuku." Those 3 words, stated so simply, felt like she unloaded her most powerful blast directly into his heart. What?" He knew what the other kids said, what some of the teachers whispered behind their hands. The boy with the useless quirk clinging to the coattails of a girl destined for greatness. A leech. A parasite. Useless. He saw, sometimes, when he used his quirk, that she would give the pebbles he moved with his mind angry glares like they'd personally offended her. But she'd never said anything. She couldn't possibly think that for real, right? Katsuki. That's not true. You're useless, Izuku, she repeated like it was a stunning revelation. You will never be a hero. You'll just get in the way. Like a little, useless pebble, getting in the way, tripping up the important people and making a mess. You are useless. He gasped for breath, trying in vain to blink the tears out of his eyes. Kachan, that hurts. Shut up, Katsuki said. Simply, stepping into his space, looming over him even though they were the same height, her dark, ruby-red eyes dominating his vision. You're delusional to think you could ever be anything more than useless, Koishi. Deku Koishi, a useless, worthless little rock only fit for stepping over. Being a hero is a road filled with danger. All you are, Deku, is a childish distraction on a path where distractions kill. Her eyes blazed with anger. You're nothing but a pebble, the smallest of stepping stones on my road to being a hero. The greatest hero of all time. You are useless. With the last 3 words, she shoved him back another step until his back was against a tree. So stay out of my goddamn way, Deku. Or I'll kick you aside. You worthless little extra. Even though his eyes were wide and tears poured down his cheeks, Izuku summoned some hidden well of strength and pushed her back. That's not true, Kachan. I'm not. She shoved him hard enough that his spine bounced off the bark, dropping to a knee to rip a handful of earth from the ground and slap it into his hand. Prove it, she growled, one hand gripping the front of his shirt. Use the pebbles, Koishi. Make them do something other than float, or spin or whatever. Hurt me, Deku. Prove me wrong. He blinked at her, gaping at the handful of dirt and rocks in his hand. Kachan, he inhaled sharply as she shook him roughly. Breath coming in sobbing gasps, he turned his attention to the rock and felt his power latch on, the extraneous dirt falling away as the pebbles began to float above his skin. Come on, Zuku, Katsuki whispered, and the pebbles began to spin. Come on, Izuku, do something, she roared in his face, the rocks escaping through nerveless fingers. He looked down at the hand grasping his collar, up at her face, then down at the ground. His face crumpled and he began to sob. She let him go, and he fell to his hands and knees in the dirt. That's what I fucking thought, she muttered, a pained expression and a flash of regret shining in her eyes. But her thoughts were dominated by a vision of the future. Izuku, jumping into a battle to save her, taking on someone more powerful, and dying horribly, his chest ripped open. His green eyes glazed, soft face frozen in a terrified rictus. Of a funeral, Inko crying over a casket as it was lowered into the ground. You stay away from me, Deku. I don't want your worthlessness stopping me from my destiny. Deku Koishi, useless little pebble, and then she turned and walked away, hands in her pockets. Izuku bowed his head to the ground and cried freely, heart shattered into a million little pieces. Underneath his hands and knees, unseen, the rocks within his field dissolved into grains of sand. Ellipsis. After their confrontation, the rest of the school day saw a depressed Izuku say nothing, and barely acknowledge anyone or anything, except for the ending bell. The teachers picked up on it, but they didn't care. A few hours free from his constant muttering under his breath was welcome. His mother also immediately noticed his mood but, despite her gentle prying, he refused to answer. It was only over dinner, chicken soba with vegetables, that she got a word out of him. Mom, his voice low, hoarse and sad, and his green eyes reflected those emotions as he peered at her from under his lashes. Am I useless? What? She jumped in her seat, surprised by the shrillness of her voice. Oh Izuku, honey, no, you're not useless, not at all. You're a smart young boy, friendly, too. And you're absolutely adorable, maybe a little shy, but you've got little Katsuki as friend and... Mom, he interrupted her with a surprisingly firm tone, making her blink. He'd never spoken to her like that. She didn't know he could talk like that at all. Inko met her son's eyes, green like hers but darker in color. Do you think I can be a hero? Izuku. She felt her throat grow tight and tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Why you? There are other sea careers, and... Izuku set his chopsticks on the table and gripped the wooden surface with white knuckles, gritting his teeth. Mom, he nearly growled. Can I be a hero? Inko stared at him, her lower lip trembling. No, Izuku, she finally answered, a tear tracing down her cheek. My sweet boy, heroes have to be strong, otherwise, they die. And you aren't strong enough, Izuku. It's not your fault, it's just how things happen, sometimes. Her son stared back at her, and for the first time, she couldn't read what he was feeling from his eyes alone. Then his gaze fell and he slumped, the last ember of hope drowned by his last source of comfort. Thank you for the meal, he whispered, pushing back from the table and leaving the room. Izuku, Inko mumbled, the pure dejection writ large on his frame striking her heart far worse than any shouting or tears could have done. Her chopsticks slipped out of her hands and she buried her face in her sleeves to muffle the wails that escaped her mouth. Distantly, she heard a door close. Half an hour later, she'd finally been drained of grief, for now, and went to offer what comfort she could to her boy. Knocking on his door, she didn't expect him to answer, and therefore wasn't surprised when she received silence. Izuku, honey, I'm sorry. I want you to know that, okay. A mother should be the last one to stomp on their children's dreams, but, no buts, I'm your mother and I should support your dream, because it shows just how big your heart is, how brave and full of love you are, but, her lips trembled and her eyes watered. Heroes get hurt, and Izuku, just the thought of you getting hurt, it breaks my heart and I'm sorry that I hurt you. She sniffled and wiped her eyes roughly. Listen, Izuku, maybe I let being your mom get in the way. Maybe you can still be a hero. There are more ways than just punching people, okay? We can talk about it tomorrow, when you're feeling better. There was still no answer, and Inko bit her lip in worry. The thought of her son hating her or worse, loathing her dispassionately, it may have been a stretch, but it still terrified her. Izuku, can I come in? I just want a hug, and then I'll leave you alone, okay? Izuku. She knocked, but silence was the only answer, not even the rustle of a blanket or the creaking of a chair. I'm opening the door, okay. She eased the door open and stuck her head in, only to freeze as her heart skipped. The room was empty. Besides his backpack slumped against his closet, there was no sign of him. The bed was still made, there were no notebooks scattered on his desks. Only his posters and action figures filled the room, staring at her silent, glossy eyes. Izuku, Inko murmured, her chest heaving as a shot of cold adrenaline dripped down her spine. Her mind jumped, and she remembered the sound of a door closing. It was only now that she realized that it had come from the front door. Her bare feet slapped the wooden floor as she raced for the door, the knob turning itself and opening it before she could touch it. Izuku. There was no one on the landing. She descended the stairs faster than she thought she could move, nearly tripping several times before she emerged into the sidewalk. Izuku. There were only a few people milling about, and most barely looked up from what they were doing. She grabbed a man with ram's horns by the arm. Have you seen a little boy with fluffy green hair, beautiful emerald eyes and a round, sweet face with freckles? Nope, he said flatly, pulling his arm out of her grasp. Inko felt her world crashing down around her. Everywhere she looked, she couldn't find even a hint of Izuku. Chest heaving from fear, she quickly dashed the tears building in her eyes and hurried back up to her apartment to grab her phone. Ellipsis. Izuku wasn't sure where his feet were carrying him, only that it was away from the pain that seemed to come at him from all sides. It had started with the doctor, then his mother, now his best friend hated him, and his mom agreed with her. He was useless, everyone agreed. Would All Might agree with them? The desperate part of his mind asked. He didn't want to know the answer. Izuku sat down on a bench and looked up at the sky. Even the world is laughing at me, he thought bitterly. Such a terrible day should have been overcast or even stormy to match the tumult of his life, but the sky was clear and the sunset painted the sky in beautiful streaks of purple and orange. As he looked up at the clouds, he felt the pain in his heart slowly dissipate, and his thoughts wandered. Maybe being a pro-hero isn't possible, he thought with discomfort, grimacing as it betrayed his very dream to even acknowledge it. But There are other ways to help, aren't there? I just don't see how my useless quirk could help. Maybe Mom will know. Though it hurt to think of it, perhaps his dream needed changing. He looked down from the sky at the buildings around him. Oh great, I'm lost. He sighed and tried to stifle the fear building in his chest, casting his eyes around for a familiar point of reference, falling on a convenience store with a large front window. Well, they'll at least have a phone and I can call Mom. His eyes widened and he gripped his head in panic. Oh no, Mom, she's probably so worried. He looked at the strange buildings, their looming presence suddenly hostile as the sunset, once peaceful, gave way to the dark of night. I want my mommy. Hopping off of the bench, he scurried over to the store, eyeing the shadows as they grew. But as he approached the door, he heard shouting muffled by the glass. Chancing a glance through the plate glass window and froze at what he saw. Behind the counter huddled a pair of adults, one with mouse ears and the other with the teeth of a squirrel. On the other side of the counter stood a man in a dirty trench coat, a hand held threateningly near his mouth. His lips were oddly thick and the back of his hand appeared to have a speaker growing out of it. He was shouting something at another figure near the door, a rookie hero from the look of her or possibly a vigilante, one he didn't recognize, holding a pair of batons with one pointed at the villain. The villain's eyes flickered over to Izuku then back to the rookie, before flicking back as his eyebrows arched in surprise. The rookie hero followed his gaze and looked out of the window, her jaw falling open at the sight of a kid staring at them in muted surprise and horror. The villain smiled cruelly and blew into his fingers, a visible wave of sound radiating from his speaker hand directly at the window, and the 8-year-old on the other side. As if air has been replaced by molasses, the window went opaque, cracks spider webbing across the surface before it burst with high-pitched shriek. One shard near the center of impact burst out before the rest, meeting the flesh of Izuku's cheek and carving a bloody line through the skin under his right eye. His mind raced, the pain providing a cruel burst of adrenaline. His eyes were wide with terror as he watched the wave of glass begin to rain towards him, his thoughts helpfully reminding him of the hero fights he'd watched, some of the bloodier things he'd seen coming to the forefront. What was descending on him was freshly broken plate glass. If he was lucky, he'd be shredded to the bone in an instant. I just distracted a hero and gave a villain an opening to kill me and get away, he thought distantly even as a scream ripped out of his throat and his arms came up to desperately cover his face. I really am useless, and now I'm gonna die painfully, will Kachan cry at my funeral. His life, short as it was, flashed through his mind. His mother, sweetly holding him after he'd fallen and scraped his knee. Auntie Mitsuki playfully ruffling his hair after he'd beamed Kachan with a pillow. All Might, the greatest hero, someone he'd never met in person, but whose legend, strength and infallible smile had built his dream of doing the same, protecting the innocent and comforting them with nothing but a broad grin. And finally, Katsuki herself. Even after the events of that afternoon, she still had a special place in his heart as his first, best friend, though she'd done her best to rip it out and grind it into the dirt. The first time they'd met, her playfully annoyed glare as he stumbled over her name. How every time, except for the last, when he called her Kachan, and she grumbled about him butchering her name even as her ruby eyes glittered in the way he knew meant she enjoyed it. Every sleepover where, bar none, she started a pillow fight. She usually won, but he gave as good as he got. But then he saw something else. Katsuki all grown up, standing shoulder to him as they stood tall against a horde of shadowy villains. Together, not as hero and sidekick, but as partners, equals. The future he so desperately dreamed of. The dream he would never achieve if he died. I don't want to die, he shouted in his head as the rain of glass fell on him. He braced for the unbearable pain of being mulched by shards of sharp silicate, and continued to brace. Nothing happened. Izuku squeezed an eye open and glanced around. His arms, still up to cover his face, were undamaged. As was the rest of his body. The foot he had instinctively curled into his chest to minimize his profile slowly lowered onto the ground, and he dropped his arms, followed shortly by his jaw. The entire section of sidewalk was practically carpeted in shards of glass, except for the immediate area around and behind the 8-year-old boy. Izuku patted himself down, a disbelieving laugh escaping his lips as he looked up at the adults in the store. All 4 of them were gaping at him, the rookie hero with naked relief on the visible parts of her face. "I'm all right," he cheered, the sheer relief he felt buoying him. The villain remembered just where he was and what he'd tried to do. He spun on his heel and raced toward the back of the store. "He's running." The heroine's head snapped towards the criminal, a snarl on her lips. "You tried to kill a kid. You're dead, asshole," and then she jetted off after him to dispense righteous justice upon his ass. And subsequently the rest of him. Her words pierced through the haze of, "Oh thank God I'm still alive," juice running through Izuku's body, and he paled. "I almost died," his brain screeched, and he took off running. He wasn't looking, but if had been, he would have seen and heard that his footfalls on the broken glass didn't crunch even slightly, and that every step left a perfect space of bare concrete. His eyes darted up to a sign and he breathed a sigh of relief as he recognized the name. Still running on a heady mix of mind-numbing fear and sheer relief, he dashed down the sidewalk, stopping next to the mouth of an alley near his home. As he caught his breath, he noticed something. He was breathing hard, yes, but it was coming back quicker than it had before, and if anything, he felt light, like he could keep running for longer. As he wondered why, his skin prickled strangely. Pulling up his sleeve revealed a coating of glass shards innocently sticking to his skin, as if they'd been there all along. Izuku hiked up a pant leg and sure enough, there were more on his pale, bony legs. He yanked open his shirt and boom, more glass. Blinking, he unconsciously focused his quirk and the glass rose from his skin and began to move. And then he remembered that glass is really sharp and he was really fleshy. The glass halted mid-spin, then zipped back to his skin. He giggled a little as it tickled him, and noted that, with all the glass pressed together, it kind of resembled snake scales or chain mail. Holding up a hand, Izuku directed the glass to slowly crawl up his arm to his hand, marveling as it twinkled like miniature diamonds in the low light. Glass is a mineral, so it's not just pebbles and rocks. "I wonder what else I can control," he muttered to himself. The glass around his hand almost resembled armor, like that worn by Tech Knight. The image of the gauntlet formed in his mind, sketched out in detail by his thoughts. His hand tickled and silently, the glass flowed into solid, protective plates around his skin. The planes of glass were opaque, but held firm under a testing tap. Izuku blinked and flexed his fingers. "Why does it feel so easy to move my hand?" he wondered aloud, rubbing his forefinger and thumb together. There was no grinding or crunching, just the rasp of smooth glass on smooth glass. "Wait, a telekinetic field. I'm moving my hand with my body and my quirk at the same time. Twice the movement, twice the effort, twice the strength." His eyes fell on the nearby dumpster just emptied that morning, then at his hand which curled into a fist. The glass withdrew, leaving plain flesh. He grimaced but threw his fist at the dumpster. It let out a disappointed little bong, and he clutched his hand to his chest, trying not to cry. Izuku breathed deep and felt the pain eventually fade into a dull throb. He focused and the glass flowed back up to become a silicate gauntlet. He grit his teeth, drew his arm back, and threw it forward. His knuckles impacted the metal of the dumpster, and the metal gave, sliding back a foot with a visible dent. Izuku, arms still extended, blinked and for the second time that night, a burble of stunned laughter bubbled up out of his chest. Then he thought, if I can do that with glass covering just my hand, what could I do if it covered my whole body? Which was followed by a realization. I need more glass, and he knew just where to find some. Though the shadows grew long and the night had truly begun, Izuku felt lighter than ever before, hope once more rekindled in his chest. Retracing his mad dash, the boy found himself drawn by flashing lights and distant conversation. Hiding himself from behind a trash can, he peeked out and cocked an ear to listen in. Apparently the rookie hero had, eventually, caught the speaker-handed villain and beaten him within an inch of his life. At first it seemed like she would get in trouble for excessive force, especially since the attack on a child couldn't be corroborated as his ultrasonic whistle had fried the security cameras. Thankfully, both of the clerks were willing to testify that there was, in fact, a kid and that the villain had, in fact, purposely used his quirk to either kill or at the very least severely injure a child, and were willing to testify to that. The young Midoriya kept himself hidden, though he felt strings of guilt twisting in his chest. He wasn't happy that the rookie would get in trouble, but at the same time, coming forward to tell the police would definitely worry his mother even more. So he stayed, and watched as the officer got in his car, killed the lights and pulled away. The clerk began to sweep up the scattered remains of the window, pushing it into a pile by the side of the building. As he finished sweeping, a woman called him from inside with a question about their insurance. The clerk went inside, and Izuku saw his chance. Bolting from his hiding place, Izuku reached out and touched the sole of his shoe to the pile of glass, watching with an odd smile as the shimmering shards of silicate slid up his leg and disappeared under his clothes. It felt like grains of soft sand skating over his skin, slowly covering every part of him until there was nothing left of the window. He should have felt heavy, but he felt almost lighter than air. Glass covered him entirely, weighing down his hair and resting on his face like a very poorly made mask. The door opened and he shot off in a panic. The clerk turned to look at the pile of glass and stopped upon noticing that it had vanished. He checked down one side of the street, then the other. No one. Did you dispose of the glass yet? His fellow clerk shouted from inside, and he shrugged. No skin off his back. Yes. Izuku skidded to a stop in the alley by his home, eyes wide and breathless, but for an entirely different reason. I moved so fast, he crowed in his head and also out loud, though he didn't notice. With glass or rock covering just a limb, my strength and speed are doubled. But when I'm covered entirely, it's expa, very increased. Like telekinetic power armor, he announced to himself, holding a glass-covered fist in the air. Then he looked at the dented dumpster. The back at his fist. He punched the dumpster, and his hand went straight through. The screech of shearing metal rang out in the twilight and Izuku winced at the noise, as well as the noise following when he yanked his arm back out. When no one came to investigate, he relaxed. Then he threw his hands up and whooped. Yes, my quirk isn't ga. The door at the end of the alley slammed open, startling him so bad he jumped. Two men came out, holding trash bags and grumbling, though they stopped as they caught sight of the dumpster several feet from where it was supposed to be with a hole in the middle. Then they shrugged, tossed the trash inside and went back through the door. Damn raccoons. Above them and stuck to a wall, Izuku sighed as his heart finally stopped feeling like it was about to beat out of his chest. And then his eyes went wide as he realized what had happened. He'd been startled, jumped 10 feet up and instinctively used his field to anchor himself to the brick wall. Slowly, carefully, Izuku pulled his hand free and rolled over, looking down at his hands and feet stuck to the wall. My quirk is amazing, he muttered, before looking up. Several floors of brick stretched before him, beckoning him to climb. He released his field on his right hand and slowly reached up. Then on his right foot. Then his left hand. Then his left foot. And he began to crawl up the side of the wall, quickly gaining confidence and speed until he was soon 6 stories off of the ground. He looked out over the low grouping of buildings, the smile on his face blinding even without the glass helmet around his head. Izuku looked at his hands, then down at his feet. Could I use my field to anchor just my feet? The thought of trying and failing made him lick his lips anxiously, but the thought of succeeding, that ruled over everything. Carefully, so carefully, he placed the soles of his shoes against the brick wall, redirecting the glass to free up more of his field and firmly anchored himself in place. Gulping and squeezing his eyes shut, he peeled his fingers away from the wall, one by one, and pushed himself up. His arms windmilled as he tried to keep his balance, directing his field to flow towards the wall like it was the ground, and he went still. Izuku opened his eyes and gasped. He stood on the wall like it was solid ground, as if he'd changed the orientation of just himself to sideways. His stomach heaved and a laugh escaped from his mouth, and before he knew it, he was laughing so hard he was crying. His quirk was amazing. His quirk did something. His quirk wasn't useless at all. Everyone says it's a useless quirk, he muttered to himself, flexing his glass-covered hand again. The doctor, the teachers, the other kids, Kachan. Even mom. Even me. But it's not useless. I was only trying to apply it one way, when there are so many. So many uses. My quirk is powerful. I'm powerful. I'm not useless. He threw his head back and shouted into the night, I am not useless. Izuku had never felt so free before. And then a realization struck. I can be a hero, he whispered to himself, before throwing his hands up. I can be a hero. Yes, he cheered, turning around to face the actual ground and just then realized how high up he was. Vertigo struck like a sledgehammer. He wobbled in place as his stomach heaved and his field fluctuated. Then he tilted forward with a yelp, slamming face first into the wall, holding on only by the field from his toes until, in his panic, he let go of that, too. He skidded down the side of the building, hands flailing desperately for purchase as the ground rushed up to meet him until he managed to slap a hand on the brickwork. It wrenched his arm and painfully pulled his body around, but he grabbed hold with his other hand and tried to anchor himself. He slowed, but didn't stop, sliding down the side of the building with the sound of glass grinding against rock until, 6 feet off the ground, he slowed to a stop. Panting, Izuku clutched onto the wall like a limpet until he could catch his breath. "Oh God," he muttered, resting his head against the wall. "I thought I was gonna die." His head snapped up. "I gotta tell Mom." Without thinking, he let go of the wall and fell 6 feet onto the concrete below. He landed in a crouch, the sound of breaking glass echoing in the alley. He looked down at his legs and saw spider web cracks running up and down the surface, before he flexed his field and they smoothed out. Closing his eyes in concentration, Izuku directed the glass to break apart into grains and hid them underneath his clothes. It felt fine, but that amount of glass on his 8-year-old body made his clothes appear very tight. Glass now hidden, Izuku raced up the stairs and burst through the door with a cry of, "Mom!" In the living room, a haggard Inko jumped with a scream, throwing her phone across the room before darting for the front door. "Izuku!" she wailed in relief, arms out to give him glomping of a lifetime when she stopped short, watering eyes going wide. "Mom," Izuku started excitedly, "I have something to show." "Is that blood?" Then he remembered the cut on his cheek. Ellipsis. Inko rushed them to the nearest urgent care, where it was determined that the cut was shallow enough that it wouldn't need stitches, thankfully. It would leave a scar, a straight line near his nose that went out under his eye nearly 2 inches long. If that was the cost of learning more about his quirk, Izuku decided he would pay it gladly. Once they were back home, his mother turned on him with all the motherly energy her short body could contain. She sat him on the couch and wailed about how worried she was. She cried about how scared his leaving so suddenly had made her. She sobbed about the hours she'd spent, horrified at the thought of never seeing her sweet son again. Then she raised her voice about how he was never to do such a thing again, and that he was to apologize to Mitsuki right away, because that was who she was on the phone with, just about to set off on search and rescue. Izuku had known leaving would hurt his mother, and her tears were too much for his fluffy little heart to take. The guilt tore at him and he cried too, mother and son tearfully clutching each other and wailing about how sorry they were. Eventually, though, the waterworks were capped. Inko pulled away from her son, wiping her red eyes. "Izuku honey, listen, I'm sorry about what I said. I lied, okay, I know you can be a hero, Izuku, but just not a pro, okay? You have the heart of one, but your quirk is just, it wouldn't save you and I'm sorry but I love you so please don't put yourself in danger there are other career paths, okay?" She expected that he might nod in solemn acceptance, or cry and agree or any number of things. She did not expect the sly smile he gave her. "Mom," he said gently, stepping away from the couch. "I have something I need to show you." Inko gasped in surprise as the glass flowed out from under his clothes and formed into rough armor. She shrieked when he then picked up the couch with her on it. "Izuku, how?" His armor broke apart and hid under his clothes once more. "We were all wrong, Mom. We thought it could just move rocks, but it has so many more applications than I ever thought." He looked down at his hands, glass sand swirling around in his palms before it settled on his skin. He peered up at her through his thick lashes, emerald eyes wide and hopeful. "Mom, do you think I can be a hero?" She swallowed thickly and rubbed her eyes. She had only seen the repressed energy and the sheer hope and dreams in his eyes before he'd found about his quirk. She knew he would never be satisfied with anything less. "Yes, Izuku," she gasped out, tears flowing again despite her efforts. "I know you can." She burst into tears. Izuku burst into happy tears and hugged his mother. There was a whole lot more crying. It went on for some time. Ellipsis. And then came the next day. For everyone else, Izuku's sunny disposition was a mystery after his defeated heir the day before. Students wondered why he had a bandage on his cheek, and teachers cursed to themselves as they dreaded the muttering storm that was sure to follow. He only brightened as he saw the familiar spiky blonde hair of his best friend. Ka-chan. He raised an arm to hail her, only for the events of the previous day to slam back home with a vicious spike of pain. In the excitement of his discovery, Izuku had forgotten the words Katsuki had just about eviscerated him with, how she had taken years of friendship and so easily smeared it under her shoe like it was nothing. A split-second decision was made. He had planned on telling her about his discovery. But she had hurt him so badly. He hoped that she regretted her words, that she would apologize and then he would reveal what he'd learned. Hey, I told you not to call me that, you damn nerd. But he should have fucking known. Izuku dropped his hand and his gaze as she stormed up to him. Sorry, Katsuki. Bakugo. She growled, jamming a finger in his face. You ain't my damned friend, Deku Koishi. He swallowed his ruined hopes and nodded. Okay, Bakugo. Her eyes found the bandage on her cheek, and her fist clenched with a pop of her quirk. What's that? You lose a fight with your toast this morning. Izuku looked up at her, dark green eyes meeting ruby red. Do you care? He asked softly. Her visage twisted and her hand gripped his collar. She opened her mouth to scream something, then stopped. She released her grip and shoved him out of her way. Out of my way, Deku. He watched her back as she stomped down the hall, followed by a posse of other kids. He looked down at his hand as grains of sand slipped out of his sleeve to gather in his palm and coat his skin. If that's how she wanted it to be, then fine. Let her insult him, let her think him useless. Izuku would take her insults, hurled like stones, and catch them, hide them under his clothes until he could pull them together into armor and floor her with his true power. Let her build herself, let the sycophants build her a tower. When he was ready, he'd rip out the foundations and watch it crumble. And maybe then she'd feel an iota of the betrayal, of the upheaval of his world as he felt that day when she did her damnedest to stomp on his heart. But she wasn't blowing smoke. She was naturally powerful, gifted with razor-sharp instincts and surprising intellect. She could back up what she put down, and she would only continue to get stronger. She also had 4 years for a head start. Izuku would need everything he could get to catch up, let alone surpass his best friend. He needed to delve into his quirk, study everything he could eke an advantage out of. And most importantly, he needed to train. Ellipsis. It is only at our lowest do we truly know how far we can rise. And Izuku had only just begun to step up. There are many truths about the world and how it operates. Many are dark, many are false. One that is neither is this: hard work and determination beat natural talent eventually. But when your rival is both naturally talented and determined, to match that, one needs more than hard work, more than simple determination. Another truth is this: sanity is overrated. Underneath the smiling surface, dug beneath the diamond core of determination, there was a truth in the depths of the pebble called Midoriya. Izuku was just a little bit nuts. Ellipsis. Izuku's declaration, momentous as it was to only him, set him down the path that many call a no-life road. It was habit that made him begin to follow Katsuki as soon as lunch was declared, and it was his promise that made him stop, spin on his heel, and head to the library instead. It would be the first time he spent the entire break reading. It wouldn't be the last. The librarian had taken one look at Izuku and then loudly declared him to be the most precious thing she'd ever seen, and gladly pointed him towards the section on physical education. And then when he'd come back after 5 minutes of trying to read an advanced textbook, she handed him a dictionary. After spending most of lunch reading the textbook, then translating with the dictionary and then reading again to make sure he actually understood what it was saying, Izuku was disappointed to discover that he was, in fact, a child. The book laid out in no uncertain terms that making a child do high-intensity workouts to build muscle was a terrible idea and would most likely stunt their growth and future potential. What it did offer, however, is that if a child is determined to reach a certain level of physical fitness later in life, then starting out with low-intensity activities such as jogging and light calisthenics to create habits that could then be used as a jumping-off point for the more serious things was the way to go. So when Izuku got home that night, he told his mom over dinner that he wanted to start jogging in the mornings. Inko was of two minds on the subject. On one, She was glad her son was showing his determination so quickly and willing to begin improving himself and his chances at making it as a pro hero. On the other, well, she wasn't fat, per se, just on the dumpy side. She'd gained weight having a kid and hadn't really shed it in the years since. Also, she wasn't about to let her sweet boy out of her sight to go running around town at 8. So Inko did what she usually did when she was in need of help. She called Bakugo Mitsuki. Now, Inko and Mitsuki on the surface seemed like the kind of people who would hate each other on sight. Inko was shy and quiet, always ready to burst into tears of joy or sadness or relief or sleepiness sometimes. Mitsuki was brash, loud-mouthed and unapologetically sassy, a trait her daughter shared. The two women were very much opposites, at least on the surface. In fact, when they first met, Mitsuki had labeled Inko as an easy mark, some who could be forged into a minion with the right pressure. To that effect, she stole Inko's lunch, a katsu pork sandwich. Inko had then used her quirk and pulled an open can of milk tea at the back of Mitsuki's head. They had been best friends ever since. While on the surface they seemed dichotomous, they were, at their core, people who felt emotions very intensely who just expressed them differently. Together they created a fine balance that had served them well in their careers until they'd met their husbands and married. They'd gotten pregnant around the same time, gave birth within weeks of each other and supported each other in the raising of the other kid. Inko had left her field to be a mother, seeing as her husband worked overseas. Mitsuki and her husband worked at the same firm designing clothes and had jumped right back in as soon as she'd popped. Basically, when Inko called and asked Mitsuki if she would come along on morning jogs with her and Izuku, the other woman was pleased as punch and accepted immediately. Her hope was that, while exercising, she might finally convince her friend to take better care of herself and also possibly model some of their clothes. Inko was, of course, the perfect size for the children's extra tall section. That was only halfway a joke. Their first outing was, put bluntly, embarrassing. Izuku was young and got tired easily, but also sprang back. Mitsuki was a regular jogger and thus led the pack. Inko, however, she was out of shape and had no form, so she huffed and puffed after the first couple of minutes. After the requisite 5 minutes of teasing, the blonde woman showed her what she was doing wrong and they set off again. That was the beginning of Izuku's regimen, and later added simple things like jumping jacks and whatnot. Stalled though he was physically, that didn't stop the young boy from focusing on what he could improve, his usage of his quirk. It was during this study of his power that Izuku determined something: he had absolute control of any rock or mineral that entered his field. That meant he could pick up a pebble, break it down into a pile of sand, then clump it back up into a pebble. Or flatten it into a plate or a scale or into small knives. He also realized something else. The speed of his quirk, breaking down, shaping and solidifying, was dependent on his brain power. Telekinetic field, you see. Better brain, better telekinesis. Izuku remembered, before that fateful night, that the biggest leap in what his quirk had been able to do had occurred after he'd started school. It was a fairly obvious leap to make, even for a child, though he did have to look the word up in the dictionary before he told his mother. Mental acuity equaled quirk acuity. And so, in his free moments between sleep, jogging and school, Izuku was reading whatever he could his hands on. Fiction, non-fiction, textbooks and magazines. Whatever could expand his knowledge, he devoured. When he understood the words, that was. The school librarian was all too happy to lend him a dictionary or her knowledge whenever he needed it. And Katsuki was all too happy to call him a nerd when she bothered to pay him any obvious attention. This also meant, to his joy, that his favorite activity of watching hero fights and observing, examining and breaking down their quirks was technically exercise. He had to peel himself away from the all-might fights, though. Everyone knew that his quirk was impossible to fully analyze. With all of his training, studying and generally living, Izuku was a busy, albeit quiet, little bee. And life moved on. Ellipsis. Izuku, age 10. Ellipsis. 2 years later, things were much the same as before. Izuku, his mother and Mitsuki and occasionally her husband, Masaru, still jogged in the mornings, though for longer periods and with greater ease. Inko had, After several months and several pounds later had confidently stated that she might maybe possibly model a few clothes or so for the fashion firm her best friend worked at. Maybe, if she was comfortable, and had the time, and if the thought of people she didn't know taking pictures of her didn't make her want to hide under the couch. She could comfortably fit under there now. And also if she could model anything other than clothes for teenagers. She was a grown-ass woman with a kid, damn it. As a consequence of his constant reading, studying and training, Izuku was very lean, led his class in grades and had absolutely zero friends. His mother didn't count, she was his mother. Mitsuki didn't count either. They were friendly, and she loved to ruffle his hair, but she did that to his mom, too. The closest thing he had was Itsuko, the librarian. Even after the time they'd first met, she still loudly proclaimed him to be the most precious boy ever. Profusely, and whenever he needed it, though the instances had become further and further in between, she offered her knowledge along with tea and snacks on occasion. Katsuki, on the other hand, had many friends, though more akin to followers and sycophants than anything more intimate. Awed by her quirk and her growing ability to use it, many of the teachers took it upon themselves to ease her rise, as it was, when her temper got the better of her or someone wanted to challenge the top dog. A few brushed instances of quirk usage aside later, it wasn't uncommon to see her holding a handful of flashing miniature explosions to show off or intimidate another kid. Izuku thought it was rather sad, actually. All those kids and teachers praising her for her quirk, even attributing it for her high test scores for some reason. As expected of someone with such a powerful quirk, he may have been biased, but he thought there was more to admire about Katsuki than just her ability to explode. For some reason, possibly out of respect for their mothers, their previous friendship, or just the fact that he kept to himself, she tended to let him be. On occasion, though, she'd drop in to yank his pigtails, so to speak. "The hell are you doing with that book, Deku?" she growled at him one day, as he sat outside in the sun to read a book on geology. "Well, it is lunchtime, so I thought I might eat it," he replied dryly, marking his place with his thumb and closing it, setting the bento on his lap aside. Bakugo snorted, though whether it was because she thought it was funny or because she didn't was a mystery. She grabbed the book and tilted it up to read the words on the spine. "The useless little pebble reading about pebbles, huh, Deku Koishi. Think maybe that'll make your weak-ass quirk any better. You never know," Izuku said evenly, meeting her eyes. Deep inside, a part of him sort of hoped she might sit down with him and ask about it. "Yeah, fucking right," Katsuki grunted, shoving a finger in his face. "Read all the books you want, Deku, but a polished pebble is still a pebble. Remember that, Deku Koishi." But he knew better. One of her hanger-ons, a chubby kid with small wings on his back, guffawed inelegantly. "Yeah, Deku Koish." Without breaking eye contact with Izuku, Katsuki reached over and seized the boy by the front of his shirt. "Come up with your own names, Butterball, or shut up." Her hand crackled, and when she released him, his tie and shirt had a cluster of circular burn marks. Then she snagged one of Izuku's onigiri and stomped off. Izuku watched her go. The other hanger-on tried to grab a rice ball, too, and he sharply smacked the back of his hand with the book. With dirty looks, the pair scurried after Bakugo like a pair of eager puppies. Deku Koishi sighed and went back to his reading. As far as his quirk went, there hadn't been much progress on that front, simply an increase in speed. While he wasn't happy, per se, Izuku knew it would be a long road to advancement. He continued to read, to run and study, laying the foundations for the future. Ellipsis. Izuku, age 11. Ellipsis. There also wasn't much advancement a year later, just a few interesting occasions. One morning Inko begged off their jog as her husband and Izuku's dad, Hisashi, had called from his job in another country with news. So it was only Mitsuki and Izuku running that morning. It was afterwards that something interesting happened. "All right, Bonsai-chan," Katsuki's mother teased, ruffling his sweaty hair even as she breathed hard. "We're close to my home, so come on in and I'll get us some water before we head back, all right?" "Sure, Auntie Mitsuki," Izuku panted, wiping the sweat from his forehead before bolting down the path. "Race you, you brat," she called with a grin, racing after him. He was smaller and had more energy, but she had longer legs and also knew the shortcuts. Chuckling to himself as the building came into sight, he chanced to look over his shoulder and blinked upon seeing that there was no one behind him. He had just begun to frown when the bushes ahead of him shuddered and Mitsuki jumped out with a war cry. He yelped and managed minimal resistance as she quickly got him in a headlock, purposefully shoving his face against the side of her chest and smearing him with her sweat. Ha ha, she crowed victoriously, roughly rubbing his hair like he was an excitable puppy. Age and treachery win over youth and treachery any day. Mitsuki Ba-chan, Izuku yelled, trying in vain to escape her grasp until he was sweaty enough to just slide right out. Immediately grabbing his tank top, he scrubbed at his face both to get it off of him and to hide his burning face. You're gross. Ah, who's a cute lil bonsai-chan, she cooed aggressively, throwing an arm around his shoulders and dragging him towards her door. You should be happy I'm so generously sharing my sweat with you. Not everyone is so lucky. Izuku, still red in the cheeks, scrubbed at his chin. Why would anyone want to share sweat? He grumbled to himself as she led them through the hall to the kitchen. As he sat down on a stool near a kitchen island, Mitsuki chuckled gleefully to herself and tweaked his nose. In a year or two, you're gonna remember this moment and the context is gonna hit you like a truck. I wish I could see your face when it does. Izuku frowned thoughtfully at her back as she went around grabbing cups and fruit for a light snack, but for some reason his eyes drifted downwards. He'd seen her in shorts and yoga pants before, almost every day, but for some reason seeing her now, watching her reach for a glass high up felt different somehow. And why was his face hot? Diverting his gaze away from whatever Mitsuki was doing, his eyes fell on the counter and a sheaf of loose paper spread across it. Curious, he pulled the nearest paper closer and looked closely. It was a sketch of a summer dress worn by a faceless woman in various poses. And on another paper was a sweater, but the sketch had a face, his mother, wearing a confident half-smile and a lovely long sweater. What are these? He asked aloud, looking up as Mitsuki set a couple glasses of water and a cutting board with all the slices of apples and oranges on it. I'm a designer. They're designs, she said around a mouthful of apple. Not bad, right? Your mama's already cute as a button but she'd look so huggable in that sweater. Izuku hummed to himself, peering closer. He could make out the designs on the sweater, a small pattern of simple knots. It reminded him of his rough sketches of various heroes, but the ones he was looking at then made his seem like drawings made by a child. Because they were. Can you teach me? The words left his mouth before he'd really thought of them, and he blinked in surprise. His thoughts were mirrored on Mitsuki's face, who paused mid-bite. You like 'em that much? She asked with a pleased smile, before tapping her chin in thought. The problem with that, though, is that I'm kinda busy. Oh wait, Masaru can help. Hold up, I'ma go ask him what you'd need to start. Oi, Masaru. She stomped off to find him, leaving Izuku to snack and look at the other sketches. Then the front door slammed shut and Katsuki came marching into the kitchen with a towel thrown over her shoulder and sweat on her face. She paused as she beheld him sitting at the counter, a slice of apple sticking out of his mouth. The hell are you doing at my home, Deku? Izuku bit off the section in his mouth and held it up. Snacking, he said simply. She snorted and marched off, calling back over her shoulder, snack at your own house you damn nerd. This is my own house, brat. Not you, hag. Who are you calling hag? Mitsuki eventually made it back to the kitchen, where she handed Izuku a thick notebook of blank paper. I'll email you the basic stuff to get you started and then you can show me what you've drawn. And if you need help, don't be afraid to call me or Masaru, okay? Izuku sniffed and hugged the notebook to his chest, a happy tear forming in his eye. Thank you so much, Mitsuki Ba-chan. When the more advanced stuff comes around, you'll have to call me Tsuki-sama. She declared with a victorious finger, before pausing. No, wait, Tsuki-sensei. Ha, he nodded fervently. Okay, Tsuki-sensei. He was still sniffling happily. Don't you start crying Bonsai-chan, you'll make me want to hug you. She held her arms out threateningly. And I'm still sweaty. Izuku sobered up so quickly it surprised a laugh out of her. Too late, she shouted gleefully. Hug. Gah. No. That too was another step on the path, another brick in the foundation. Ellipsis. Izuku, age 12. Ellipsis. Turning 12 was a momentous occasion. not only because he received a new sketchbook and pencils from Mitsuki and Masaru, as well as a chunk of sandstone from his mom and dad, he also got a library card from Itsuko. Sure, library cards were free, but this was a custom one, with a picture of the two of them that had been taken during his last day of primary school. She had left her job at the school and gotten another one at the public library, so now it wouldn't be weird for Izuku to come visit her for tea and snacks. Plus books. But it was almost momentous because Izuku was now old enough to start physical training. And his first stop was the library because no shit. It was there, near the back looking through shelves of dry, technical manuals on various beginner martial arts because, while it would be easier to learn at a dojo, that would also involve other people. Not to mention that a dojo would be expensive. It was as he was putting back a manual on karate that he saw it. A slim red booklet, dusty from disuse and unadorned except for one word. Serration. Immediately inside on the first page, there was a note. If you are reading this, then it is no mistake that you found it, for the call of destiny is strong and writ across the pages in every character. What you have found, what has called to you is a primer on the style whispered on quivering lips, murmured in fear behind black doors. Serration. Serration is no mere martial art, it is a way of life. A way of living. A method by which you shall take the ore of yourself, leash your emotions and burn away the impurities until you are malleable. You are the metal, fury is your forge, kindled by your rage and shaped by your determination. You must harness it all and become the sword, burning white-hot and directed at your enemies. Strike at their heart, their mind and then, their body. Destroy them on every level and only then is victory achieved. Let's get you started on that, shall we? Izuku looked up from the words and frowned at the ceiling. Is this a manual for villains? It really reads like one. For some reason, though, it stuck with him. Casting his mind back for villainous thoughts, it didn't take him long to remember that day. That day when he had been broken from his first friend, cast aside on the perception of worthlessness, and the day following, when he had declared to himself his goal. And then his eyes went wide. Strike at their heart. He trained so that one day he would face down Katsuki with strength to match her, to forcibly tear away the veil of uselessness on her eyes and pierce her heart with the truth. Strike at their mind. He hid the real power of his quirk because he knew that the longer her expectations were set in stone, the bigger the impact would be when he shattered them. Strike at their body. Well, with Katsuki there wouldn't be any other way to prove it to her than by kicking each other's asses. That was just a given. It had stuck with him because, subconsciously, he had identified with it. But it wasn't one-to-one. Shattering Katsuki's worldview was secondary. His primary reason for everything since the first time he'd seen All Might jump into a fight, his mere smile bolstering the other heroes and intimidating the villains even before he threw a single punch, was to be the same. To save the innocent, protect them from those who would abuse their power. To show up and reassure everyone with his presence alone. To be a hero, not the greatest hero, not ranked number one. Just a hero. Recognition would be nice, but he would rather save lives than accrue accolades. Izuku nodded to himself and read the introduction again. He could see where the words would be villainous. But the core message could be applied to a hero as well. He decided that knowing more was worth it, especially if he was accosted by a user of the style. And there was something poetic about using villainous methods against villains. Even though it had no sleeve, no labels that said if it belonged to the Mustafu Public Library, simply taking it still felt wrong to Izuku. He took it up to Itsuko and asked to check it out. She looked down at the booklet, then back at him and blinked. Hey Izuku, did you want to check something out? She asked brightly. He tried 3 more times, and each time she would forget it existed after a blink. A little disquieted, Izuku grabbed another book on precious stones and checked that out, taking the booklet with him as he left. And so began Izuku's physical education. The first method of purifying, as the booklet called it, was resistance training. Using weights of some kind spread about the body to make it slower, heavier, harder to even move so that the muscles could develop and more speed could be achieved. Izuku realized that he already had the means with which to begin his training, his glass. He wore it constantly under his clothes, because without it he felt naked. The answer was simple. Form the glass into bands around his limbs and chest hidden under his clothes and bam, training. The first and worst problem he discovered was that his field really did not want to withdraw into his body. It took him a month by itself to simply withdraw his field from a finger alone, but that breakthrough led to his ability to draw it in completely. It was an uncomfortable feeling, suppressing his quirk, but he persevered with the quiet hope that the exercise could one day increase the range of his field. Then came the second problem with the solving of the first. His field did a lot of heavy lifting when it came to his glass. The first time he formed his glass into resistance bands and withdrew his field, he fell flat on his face. It was only the instinctive releasing of his field that meant he simply bruised his nose instead of breaking the floor. To actually use his glass, he had to bleed off small amounts at a time until he could safely carry it without his field. It was during this that Izuku was forced to amend his previous understanding of his quirk. He had almost absolute control over the minerals and rock in his field. All of the little blocks of glass he'd used to store the material came out opaque despite coming from a clear window. It irritated him, but he resolved to add more things to his studying, such as how glass was made. Previous problems thus solved and new ones added, it took Izuku about a week before he could jog even a little bit with the weight he now carried. The teasing from Mitsuki had been both a constant source of annoyance and a source of determination. Izuku really wanted her to shut up about performance issues. She wouldn't shut up until he could match her for the whole route. That presented a new problem, because there was such a lack of those. He spent weeks trudging along behind Mitsuki as she tauntingly skipped along, and her workout gear had never been anything other than tight because why wouldn't it? It was during his second month of weighted jogging that he realized, for the last 10 or so minutes, his eyes had been fixed firmly on her rear. He couldn't help but admire the way it jiggled with every impact, the way he could see the physical effects of jogging on her musculature because of her yoga pants. And that was when he heard someone clear their throat and felt an elbow poking his arm. He looked slowly to the left and saw Masaru jogging along beside him, the man's glasses fogging up slightly but not enough to hide that Izuku had definitely been ogling his wife. Masaru, instead of getting angry or teasing, simply nodded at his wife's very fine posterior and shrugged in a commiserating way as if to say, "Yeah, I've been looking too, what can you do?" Izuku's face went red and steam just about burst out of his ears. "I really don't want to be in this situation right now," he thought distantly, suddenly turning a corner and bolting. And now it's a problem for future me. Lost in his thoughts as he was, Izuku didn't realize he had released his control over his field, which automatically shifted the glass bands into sand and coated his limbs, making him run far faster than he had intended. By the time he managed to suppress his embarrassment, his feet had carried him far away, to a park of some kind given the trees and the crystal clear spring bubbling through it. There was no one there, thankfully, so Izuku sat down by the spring, bent over and shoved his face underwater. "Pub-glrglgle," he screamed into the liquid, before sitting up and screaming into the air, "Puberty." He thought he could withstand the effects, that all his studying and training would successfully distract him enough that the onset of puberty would go unnoticed until he was a pro hero. He was very wrong. Angst thus expressed, Izuku heaved a sigh and sat back near the creek. Emotional though he was, it didn't take long for the gentle burble of the water, the cool breeze rustling through the leaves to drain the emotions out of him like a sieve, leaving him peaceful and contemplative. "I know I'm going to need to explain myself when I get home, but that's another problem for future me and he's not here yet." "Ooh, is that quartz?" He stuck a hand into the water and plucked the shiny rock from the bed and held it up. "Oh, it is." He looked back down and beheld a multitude of water-smoothed rocks in various gentle shapes and colors. Shrugging, Izuku pulled off his shoes and socks and stepped into the creek, searching through the bed for little stones that caught his eye and snatching them up. One in particular was a red rock striped through with white, reminding him of the layered block of sandstone he'd received on his birthday. With a little mental flex, it lost cohesion and collapsed into a pile of sand. The different colors separated into dusty little streaks on his palm, and even with a slight swirl of his field, they remained stubbornly unmixed. Izuku frowned and focused, the sand whirling together into a tornado in his palm before going still. The rock had become a fine pink powder, but upon closer examination, he found that it was just really fine sand, the particles stubbornly refusing to mesh. Izuku growled to himself. Luckily he was alone, otherwise people would be looking for a very small angry dog. His fingers crooked into claws, burgeoning muscles tensing as he focused his will on the pile of dust in his hand. The dust began to vibrate in place, but nothing else. The water of the creek brushed over his shins and reminded him of the peace and tranquility he had felt mere moments ago. He relaxed his invisible grip and released his emotions in a quiet sigh, pulling the dust into a round pink rock. I felt it, he thought, storing it in his pocket with the other stones. I guess I'm just missing something. Maybe it'll come to me later. He huffed and bent to pick up another rock and paused as the light of the sun glinted off the water. Slowly, Izuku turned his head to gaze up at the sky and suddenly realized that it was noon. Which meant his morning jog, which had turned into panicked sprinting, had lasted for about 2 hours. It was supposed to be 45 minutes. The only upside was that it was a Saturday. Izuku scrambled out of the creek and shook his feet dry before pulling his shoes and socks back on. His pocket full of rocks clacked rhythmically as he jogged out of the park and onto a sidewalk. His eyes found a nearby street sign and sighed in relief as he saw the words, Kenobe Street. It meant he wasn't as far away from his route as he thought and he didn't need to stop for directions. With another sigh, Izuku set off towards home and what would probably be a tearful earful from his mother. It was. Later that night, Izuku sat at his desk with the round quartz rock sitting on the surface, tapping his fingers rapidly. After the tears had faded, Inko had ordered him to apologize to Mitsuki and Masaru given that his little disappearing act had made the former angry and the latter scared, especially when they couldn't find him after an hour of looking. They would be coming over in a few minutes to get his reasons for running and the other thing, and Izuku was attempting to muddle a solution that would let him hold on to a shred of dignity after the inevitable crying. His only idea was to shape the quartz into something for Mitsuki, but he was wary of trying. For one, he still hadn't managed to make his cubes of glass clear and that would ruin the whole idea in his mind. And two, that was just her, not her husband. Izuku let his fingers rest before sucking his teeth and taking the rock between his hands. He could see the opaque lines where the crystal structure spread on the insides. Clasping it between his hands, he closed his eyes and let his field sink into the stone, mapping out every minute crack and crevice within with 100 microscopic hands. Izuku opened his eyes and stared at the largest line in the mineral. He gently pressed with his field and the stone came apart in his hands. He ran his thumbs along the smooth cut, but paused as his skin prickled. He held it up to his face and squinted. There, barely visible, was a tiny chunk of something that wasn't quartz. To his mind, the structure was ordered, though not neat, and that little speck of rock interrupted it. With a mere flick of his field, the speck was separated and dropped aside. Izuku clasped the two halves back together and melded them into one. Closing his eyes once more, he dove into the rock and let his field expand into the confines. He felt the ordered nature of the quartz, and the little dots of material that weren't. Wrapping his field around them, he pulled them out and filled in the tiny gaps left behind. Then he gently smoothed out some of the more jagged lines and moved others around into a more orderly pattern. His eyes fluttered open and then went wide. The crystal, once a chaotic mess of lines under a smooth exterior, had become an expression of beauty. A thick line ran down the center, smaller ones splitting off from the top, carving through nearly clear crystal. It seemed as if it had caught a beam of light at just the right angle and the refractions the instant the sun had touched it, turning a common chunk of crystal into a stunning mosaic. But it wasn't quite right. Izuku narrowed his eyes in concentration and brushed his thumbs across the surface, coaxing the crystal into another shape while keeping the beauty of the stone untouched. When he stopped, the round rock had been shaped into a smoothly defined heart. Wow! Izuku yelped and threw his hands up in surprise, tossing the crystal heart into the air. Ah, no! He snatched at it and each time the smooth stone shot back out between his fingers until he managed to lean back and catch with both hands, suspending it in his field. Peeking at it, he sighed in relief as he saw it was undamaged, then glanced to the side to see who had scared him. It was Mitsuki. Ah! Izuku leaned away from her so hard his chair nearly toppled over, only managing to keep his balance by seizing his desk. "Am I Mitsuki Ba-chan?" he squeaked, before remembering just why she was there. Cheeks blazing, he shot to his feet, grabbed the crystal heart and presented it to her with a bowed head. "For you." I'm sorry I made you worried and had to look around and couldn't find me and made my mom cry and. This is really pretty, Bonsai-chan, she muttered, turning it over in her hands before glancing at him. You know you really had us worried there, huh Izuku? I barely got a look at your skinny ass when you bolted. Fast lil, brat, ain't ya? I gotta wonder why you ran, though. She stepped closer, looming over him with the light shining from behind her head. She looked like an avatar of cold vengeance. Is there something you want to tell me, Izuku? Like, perhaps, the reason you ran away. Izuku gulped audibly and rubbed his hands together anxiously, tongue tripping over itself as he fumbled for an excuse. How did one tell the mother of a former best friend, current jogging partner and occasional sketching teacher that he'd been caught staring at her rear, by her husband no less? There was I accidentally This went on for a good minute and a half. Just kidding, I already know, she announced with a grin, breaking out into laughter at his shocked face. Masaru told me already. I was wondering why you'd been lagging behind for the last couple of weeks, but I shoulda guessed. Mitsuki flipped the crystal heart in her palm, her teeth on full display as she held it up, leaning forward with a hand on her hip. Is that why this is a heart, Bonsai-chan? Because you love staring at me tilde. No, he squeaked, trying to cover his blushing face, I meant. It's an apology from the heart. That's all. She said, unconvinced, casting an eye at his desk. And I'm guessing you only made something for me, huh? Trying to get in my heart, as it were. Izuku looked at his desk, then at the heart in her hands and balked. Oh crap, hold on 1 second. He darted towards his chair and scrambled for something to make, before his eyes settled on a pair of small, smooth orbs of rock. Sketching for hours at a time had made his hand cramp up, and the internet had provided a solution, Chinese medicine balls. It was perfect. Izuku grabbed the block of sandstone and used his field to cut 2 even chunks out of it, running his fingers over the surface to smooth it out and distribute the material evenly. Then, calling on his practice with the quartz, shaped the separate layers into fine, nearly scalloped lines that curved around the body of the orbs. With a final brush of his fingers, they became polished and smooth. See? He asked quickly, holding the balls out. For Masaru. Mitsuki looked down at the orbs of finely polished, neatly shaped and wonderfully designed rock, then back up at him. Her eyebrow rose as a toothy grin spread across her lips. Oh ho, she chuckled, rubbing the heart between her fingers. A heart for me and some balls for Masaru. You are not a subtle lil, Bonsai-chan, are ya? Izuku blinked at her. What? Context still escapes you, huh? She wondered aloud, cocking a hip. The motion had some effects on the rest of her body, specifically her chest. Unconsciously, his eyes darted down, and he remembered the strange, embarrassing and strangely embarrassing conversation from a year ago. Then his face went red, followed by his neck and the rest of his visible skin while his cheeks puffed out with a restrained scream. Mitsuki burst out with a raucous laugh, clutching her stomach with one hand as she bent over from the force of her mirth. "You just like your mom," she wheezed, nearly crying, face goes red. Cheeks go FWOOMP. Green hair, like a ripe tomato. Ha ha ha. Izuku, still burning, sat down at his desk, set the medicine balls to the side and then thumped his head against the wood and groaned loudly. Why, hey he, you know I'm just teasing you, Bonsai-chan. She ruffled his fluffy green hair with aggressive affection, and he tilted his red face to crack an eye open. Mitsuku grinned toothily. I'd be honored to take your balls. As she started laughing again, he started thumping his head on the desk more, chanting, why, with each impact. He was stopped by his honorary aunt interposing her hand under his head and pushing him back. Come on brat, that whole, bow and present, thing was really cute, so do it again, please. Then we'll be good, she promised, though there was an edge to her smile that he didn't like. Clearing his throat, grabbing his balls, and standing, Izuku bowed and presented them to her. Tsuki-sensei, I'm very sorry for how I acted. Please take this as a token of my heartfelt apology, he mumbled out, looking directly at the floor. Mitsuki hummed thoughtfully, tapping her chin. Nah. Izuku looked up, shocked. What? She grabbed him by the back of the head and shoved his face into her shirt-clad chest with what could only be described as an evil grin. Now apology accepted. Much fun was had at Izuku's expense. Masaru accepted the Chinese medicine balls and a hug with grace, before turning the conversation to something important. A phone for Izuku. Both he and Mitsuki were about to enter the busy season and wouldn't have enough time to run with Bonsai-chan as often until it was over, but he was also old enough that he could run around the neighborhood by himself as long as he had a way of keeping in touch. A week later, Izuku found himself the proud owner of a modern smartphone. It wasn't anything cutting-edge or fancy, but it let him call, text and play music, so it worked perfectly. After that embarrassing day, Izuku added running into his schedule, with his finish line being the park he'd found himself in before. He also continued his study into the style known as Serration. The first thing, oddly enough, was meditation. Find yourself a place where the sun meets the water. The park served that purpose very well, and Izuku was beginning to get suspicious about the book. Given that no one else would acknowledge its existence. For more than a blink, perhaps there was something to the whole call of destiny thing. This is the proper environment to begin the purification. It is believed by some that there are two methods of purifying, by fire and by water. We are forging a sword. We will use both. There are two energies which allow the body to function, the physical and the mental. Of the spiritual, we will not debate, for this is a book and you are likely in public. Physical energy is generated by the organs, the bones, the nerves and the blood. Without it, we would be wandering dust, forever static except for the motion of the world around us. Mental energy is generated by thoughts, feelings, emotions and instinct. Without it, we would be simple plants, for what is life without thought except mere existence? Together, they are what give us life. The ability to think, and to act on those thoughts. There are people, even after the advent of quirks, who still prescribe to the idea that humans use only 10% or so of our brains. Those people are idiots. Humanity uses almost every part of our brain, but we are only conscious of a certain amount. The majority of it is used for unconscious means, such as breathing, pumping blood or blinking. There are still sections that remain dormant except for specific circumstances. These are what we will harness. Everything that exists can be used as a weapon, and they are no different. First, you must learn to separate the mental energy from the physical. This will be difficult. Step 1. Stop thinking. As Izuku sat by the creek, scratching his temple, he debated on whether or not he should search for the man or woman or whoever wrote the book so that he could punch them in the face and or debate philosophy. He had a feeling it would end up being both. Let your body do its thing. Let it breathe, let it pump, let it flow. Turn the eyes of your mind on itself. Step 2. Stop feeling. This will also be difficult. Do not worry about such things as hopes, dreams, thoughts, feelings and emotions. Allow logic to be your guide, and step away from your feelings. This may take you some time, but remember this, you wouldn't have found this book if you couldn't do it. Izuku took a deep breath and set the book aside, making himself comfortable in his patch of grass, the trickling of the creek playing in his ears as the sun warmed his skin, and closed his eyes. It was actually really easy for him to separate his mind from his body. All he had to do was concern himself with his field, something he'd been doing regularly to help map out crystal structures. He could feel the steady rhythm of his heart in his chest, felt his lungs expand as he breathed in under no direction from himself, and let it be. He wasn't sure how long he'd been meditating before he heard it. A quiet, wet-sucking noise, followed by a swish of liquid. It took him a moment to realize he'd just heard the exchanging of blood in his heart. And as if on cue, he could feel everything. The slight ruffle of his hair in the breeze, the liquid flow of blood traveling through his veins, the slightest of creaks from his bones as his muscles twitched, the sunlight gently pressing down his skin like thousands of microscopic fingers. Distantly, Izuku wondered how people couldn't hear their own bodies at work, how the sloshing of liquids didn't drive them mad. Then he realized that they did hear it, but it was such a lifelong constant that it was automatically tuned out, and he could see why. Human bodies were kinda gross. Turning his attention away from his body, Izuku focused on his mind, but there was no ease to be found there. His emotions swirled chaotically in his brain, his hunger, fatigue, annoyance, disgust at the noises of his body, the Ever-present arousal kept just under control. It was like a maelstrom whirling with all of his feelings, the occasional clear thought poking through like the shattered mast of a sunken ship, only to be swallowed by the morass once more. And that was when Izuku hit a metaphysical whirling water wall of whirling wetness. Trying to disconnect from his mental energy, his emotions especially, was much, much harder. It was like a family curse, even if he thankfully didn't burst into tears as often as his mother. It took him 2 weeks of extended effort to make any sort of headway. Separating from his physical energy was easy. He learned how to do it as he sat in class and as he jogged, but it was as he sat by the creek, playing with a smooth stone of smoky quartz that he realized the answer was in his hand. Delving into his meditative state, Izuku separated his physical energy and fell into the eye of the maelstrom that was his mental energy. Focusing on the stone he'd been holding, he visualized a line of jagged crystal growing from the floor, the edges parting the whirling wall of water and continuing to rise until it split, creating a rough portal just large enough for him to figuratively squeeze through. And then he was through. Before him stretched a vast infinitude warm, inviting dark, like the best blanket, bath and hot chocolate combined, just quietly calling him to let go and drift. There was nothing to feel, nothing to fear, no one and nothing to bother him, just an eternity of soft, comfortable sleep. Izuku looked back and found himself, his body sitting on nothing, face emotionless, body still. There was a line, tying him to himself. His fingers drifted to the line, and he found it ethereal. How easily it would release him, if only he would let it go. His hands clenched around the rope and it thickened until it was akin to a golden steel cable. No, he said to himself, to the darkness. I have achieved nothing. I cannot sleep. I will not let go. Hand over hand, he pulled himself back to himself until something like gravity began to pull him in. As he entered his atmosphere, he felt something from the dark. It understood. It would miss him, and it would wait for his return. And when he came back, it would pull him into its embrace and he would never worry or fear ever again. And then Izuku was outside looking in on his mental and physical energies, represented by his body sitting inside of a maelstrom. He floated there for what felt like hours, trying to figure out what he was supposed to do. It only occurred later that he hadn't actually read that far ahead. Coming back to his body was an odd sensation. For an instant, he heard all small things, the blood, the air and such, but it was filtered out for the sound of nature. Izuku flexed his fingers and felt his knuckles crack, then rubbed his hands up and down his arms. He felt cold for some reason, even though it was still sunny, though later in the day. Not even on his run back home, not even the final sprint to his building, legs burning, heart pounding, did the chill fade. He leaned against the wall next to his door and let his breathing settle, worry seeping down his spine. Why do I feel cold? Is something wrong with me? The door opened and Mitsuki backed out, calling, just think about it, okay? Let me know. Oh. She jumped a little as she turned around and found Izuku silently standing there. Her sassy smirk came back as she cocked a hip. Gettin' all sweaty just for me, Bonsai-chan. Trying to remind me of what I'm Ms. She was stunned into silence as Izuku stepped forward and hugged her, resting his temple against her shoulder. It wasn't the first time he'd hugged her, though the instances had become vanishingly small with puberty hitting him like a truck. He was on track to be taller than her in a short time. But it was the first time he'd initiated without also crying first. Mitsuki brought her arms up and rested them on his back, giving his spine a little rub. You all right, Izuku? She asked cautiously. Yeah, he mumbled into her shoulder, giving her a squeeze and stepping back, sniffling gently before he wiped his eyes and gave her a blinding smile. I just wanted you to know how much I appreciate you, Mitsuki-ba-chan. Thank you, for everything. She blinked and swallowed, feeling a prickle of uncharacteristic heat in her cheeks. You're welcome, Izuku, but it's really not that much, you know. But you didn't have to do anything, he replied, still giving her that same beaming smile. So thank you anyways. Mitsuki felt her lips curl into a gentle smile, even as she reached out and pressed her hand to his forehead. And you sure you're all right? You know you can talk to me about anything, right? I'll only tease you a little bit. At first, he pulled her hand down and patted it. I really am fine, Mitsuki-ba-chan, just appreciating what I have. Well, appreciate away. Then, she barely had to bend down to kiss his cheek. We'll go running in a couple days, alright. See you later Bonsai-chan. He gave her a wave before stepping inside of his home, finding his mom sitting on the couch fretting over a sheaf of paper. Mom. Inko looked up from the paper and released the knuckle she'd been gnawing from her maw. She didn't know why. He didn't look distressed, but something seemed off about her boy. Izuku? She asked. Izuku felt his lips tremble and his eyes well with tears even though he wasn't sad. He darted forward and wrapped his mother in a tight embrace, burying his face in the warmth of her sweater and crying silently. What's wrong? She asked, panicking as her son clutched at her like he hadn't seen her in years. Izuku. With a hitching breath, he wiped his eyes and hugged again. I love you, Mom, he whispered, and smiled when he heard her heart thump against his ear. I love you so much, thank you for being my mother. Inko swallowed thickly and ran a hand through his fluffy, slightly damp hair. I love you too, Izuku, I'm proud to be the mother of such a sweet boy. She kissed the top of his head and held him tight against her chest. Did something happen, honey? Yes, he admitted quietly, wiping his eyes on his arm as he looked up at her. A slow smile creased his face as he met her eyes. I realized how lucky I am to have you. His mother blinked, her cheeks filling with color. And then the tears started to flow. I love you Izuku, she wailed, clutching him to her. It went on for some time. Eventually, though they broke apart and Izuku helped his mother cook dinner that night, a simple chicken salad, that they ate with a smile. When all was said and done, he settled at his desk and opened the book for further instruction. Got it, good. Be aware, though, deep in this state, you will find something. Something vast and terrifyingly wonderful. The deep. You will have brushed against it once and at some point you will have broken down crying for a reason you cannot identify. It is because you long for the deep. It offers nothing less than complete comfort and contentment, a release from every trouble of the mind, the body and the world. And if you allow it, you will happily drown in the deep. It will be a constant longing, a desire so deep you will eventually forget it, and then the remembrance will drive you to despair. All this, from only the merest brush of the deep. Heed these words. If you desire ever to enact change on any scale, remember never touch the deep, ever. It will wrap you in a blanket of comfort and you will never escape. But since you are reading this, that means you were able to hold on to your body and tether yourself with your determination. That is why it will be the core of your weapon. Good on you. Izuku resisted the urge, barely, to hurl the book across the room. That's why I felt so cold. That's why I held on to my mom like a baby. He growled deep in his chest and took a deep breath, letting the anger flow out with his breath and continued to read. Now that you have successfully separated your mind and body energies, it is time to begin visualizing them. The body is solid, yet pliable, imagine wood. The mind is ethereal, fleeting yet ponderous, imagine water. Izuku gave himself a flat look in his mirror. Gather the wood into your chest, near the heart. Spark it, let it build. Breathe life upon it, let it burn. Gather the water into a ball. Spin it and let the driftwood and the algae fall away until it is pure. Let it be as fast or slow as it needs and keep it shaped, but most of all, let it flow. When you have achieved this, continue reading. It took Izuku weeks to visualize and gather the wood, and longer still to gather the chaotic maelstrom of his thoughts into a ball. He thought, at first, that he was meant to seize the water and force it into shape, but it was water. It slipped through his fingers faster than he could grab it, and that stalled him for a good few days. It was as he was staring at the creek, lamenting his lack of progress, that he dug a small hole in the ground and scratched a small channel leading to the water itself, that he realized why he had failed. Water was liquid. It could not be seized by hand alone. It had to flow, but it could be directed. With that in mind, he delved into his meditative state and stood in the eye of the whirlpool. He stepped outside of it and laid a hand on the surface. With his will, he coaxed it to spin down and around. It splashed and thrashed, but with patience and time, it began to spin. It lifted from the ground and became an orb. Glassy smooth on the outside, clear all the way through, but the water flowed swift and sure. And then he had a ball of water and a bundle of sticks. Yay him! The next stalling point came at attempting to burn the wood. Izuku had visualized it as wood, Yes, but the supple young branches were still green beneath the bark. They didn't want to catch fire. How the hell do I spark it? He wondered to himself, idly flipping a pair of rocks, one a chunk of onyx and the other a piece of marble. The clicking of the rocks as they bounced in his hand soothed him as the problem continued to vex him. And then an idea struck. The wood sat near his heart, where blood flowed the most, where the heat was. Thump thump. Like a flint striking steel, he imagined. Thump thump. There were no sparks, only the slightest smoke. Faster. Thump thump. Faster. Thump thump. Faster. Thump thump. The wood caught alight and a fire roared to life in Izuku's chest. He screamed internally, hands clenching around the rocks as sweat beaded on his forehead. The pain was horrifying, he could feel his veins shriveling and curling in the heat. Water, he cried, and the orb of his mental energy began to spill outward, flooding down his throat to his chest and dousing the flames. But that wasn't the end. The flames smoldered weakly, and weakness seeped into every inch of his body. He felt like tipping over and falling asleep, but somehow he knew that if he did, he wouldn't wake up. He sparked the fire again and the warmth gave him comfort, but it was only seconds later that it burned too hot, too bright. He knew dousing the fire wouldn't save him, and letting it burn wasn't an option. Balance was needed. Izuku allowed a thin stream to spill from his water. The fire flared and rose in response, but didn't die, though the heat was still too much. A little more water poured forth, the flames reached higher. The water fell, the fire rose and then they touched. The tongue of flame brushed the orb of water and it hissed. The stream of water spilled onto the sun and it crackled. Then they began to pull at each other, and Izuku felt dread. He knew that if they collided, they would snuff each other out and he would suffer for it. His hands clamped around both spheres, one searing hot and the other burning cold, and tried to push them apart. But they refused to move away and pulled ever closer. His muscles stood out like steel cables as he held them back, his teeth clenched in a rictus grin. "I won't let this happen," he screamed mentally, the veins bulging in his neck. He recalled the deep, the sucker it offered, and the thread that pulled him back. His determination was brighter than the fire, heavier than water, and it was his. "I will not die, I will not die," and that was the catalyst that pierced through the two warring energies. The fire pulled in the water through the gold cord of his determination, but gently, evenly. The water soothed the fire and fed it at the same time. Then they pulled together again, but in harmony, spinning around and around the golden center until they finally met. And then they exploded. Energy flooded through his veins in the form of glowing golden water, filling him from his toes to his hair with life. Izuku's eyes snapped open and he sucked in a deep breath, every limb from fingers to toes tingling. He clenched his hands and gasped as pain shot up his arm. Looking, he saw why. He hadn't let go of the rocks he'd been holding and they'd cut into his palm, with thin streams of blood dripping down the gaps of his fingers. Grimacing, he pried his fingers open, then paused in shock. There, sitting innocently in his blood-stained palm where two rocks should be, was a puddle. Not of blood or sweat, but liquid rock. It was pleasantly warm against his wounds and flowed like syrup, thick but smooth. With a flex of his field, the liquid flowed together and mixed, becoming something other than onyx and marble alone. He pressed down on the field, willing it to become solid, and let it go. It collapsed to sand in his hand. His still bleeding hand. Izuku hissed in pain, but couldn't suppress his energy and jumped to his feet. "Mom!" he shouted, belatedly remembering the fact that she was a few miles away. He took off running, and even with his resistance bands still tight around body, he felt lighter and more energetic than before, even after his morning run and workout. It took him no time at all to reach home, but he was still so bubbly with energy that he sprinted around the block a couple times more. And then he burst into the living room waving a bloody hand around and calling for his mother. Naturally, chaos ensued. After his hand was bandaged, Izuku showed her how he had liquefied rock without melting it by tapping into the combined energies, turning a chunk of red and beige sandstone into orange sand. That inadvertently showed her that fact that he couldn't change it back, but she hugged him and told him she believed he could do it. He'd come that far, after all. It was a few minutes later when the energy faded and the hunger struck. It was sated with a few apples, 2 bananas, an orange, a quick salad and 3 packets of instant ramen, but even after he'd consumed the last drop, Izuku felt his stomach growl. Though he desired to help his mother cook, he left for his room when he realized he had been seriously considering eating uncooked noodles. And, more importantly, the book was waiting. If you are reading this, that means you survived the process through which, with a core of determination, you have successfully fused your mental and physical energies. That means you have been upgraded from raw ore to a purified ingot. Congratulations. For that, as well surviving the numerous ways you could have died horribly. Let me list a few. Drifting into the deep. Permanent coma, followed by death. Extinguishing your physical energy. Your heart would have stopped beating and you would have died. Also brain hemorrhage, asphyxia or an aneurysm. Being consumed by your physical energy. An immediate blood-boiling fever, followed by death. Also burst heart, ventricles, veins, aorta and such. Not balancing your energies. Permanent enfeeblement, spontaneous combustion. Again, congratulations. You may now scream internally and desperately hug a loved one. Izuku did just that, and then he sat in the shower, letting the water rain onto his body as he rocked on the tile floor in the fetal position, sharp mind and imagination very clearly depicting the various ways he could have died. When that was finally over with, he sat down at his desk and began to read again. Now that you are done, it is time to reveal the reason behind the tasks you have performed. With your physical and mental energies combined, they have become what is known in many parts of the world as ki, kai, chakra, or simply, life energy. Yes, you read that right. You are now a wielder of the legendary inner power of which only very few have ever come close. Ultimate power is at your fingertips. Soon you will learn to enhance your body, to fly, to walk on walls and water, to tap into the very elements themselves through specific hand seals, to gather them into your very palms and fire them as a devastating beam while yelling very loudly. Ellipsis. Just kidding. Izuku slammed his head into his desk, groaning painfully. For a second there, he'd actually believed what the book had described to be possible and had felt anxious, incredulous and astounded all at once. Only for that to get cut off abruptly. Peering at the last two characters, there was an annotation in brackets, written in English. His class had only just begun learning it that year, and he was no expert, so he turned to the internet. What is this? He muttered to himself, tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth as he slowly hunted and pecked to spell the sentence out. GET, space, BAITED, space, LOL. He pressed enter, and the translation came back in seconds. And then he proceeded to throw the book across the room. Ellipsis. It was a few weeks later that his irritation with the book had cooled down sufficiently for him to not feel, as the book had so kindly stated, baited. Still growling to himself, he cracked it open and found the page he'd been reading last while skipping over the last section. He wasn't sure he'd be able to keep his temper if he read it again. None of those previous things are achievable with life energy. It is, quite simply, a method by which you can use to recover quickly to expand the results of training, or in a lull in a life or death battle for an edge. If you would prefer a pseudo-scientific explanation, it is directing the attention of the unconscious brain away from unnecessary things to very necessary things. This comes at a cost, as do all things. If the attention is directed away for too long, those unnecessary things will overwhelm you and you will die quickly if you are lucky. Returning to the more metaphorical, imagine your life energy as a gallon jug of extremely high-proof alcohol. If you chug it all at once, you're dead. But a sip every once in a while will serve you well. Responsible use comes with a cost. What was taken must be returned, and you will not regenerate life energy forever on your own. You will get hungry. A lot. Have a secure source of food always on hand. Izuku frowned and set the book down, feeling guilt as well as hunger gnawing at his stomach. He had indeed been tapping into his chakra to replenish himself after a few particularly grueling runs as caused by his increasing the weight on his resistance bands. While the hunger that followed hadn't been as bad as the one following the unlocking, he'd still demolished more than 3 servings of katsudon. He had seen his mother fretting over the state of the fridge and had vowed to slow down, but that too made him guilty. What right did he have to be a hero if he wouldn't give his all, even in training? He rapped his fingers on his desk and stared at the pile of glittering sand that diligently refused to come together as a rock. A light tap into his chakra would turn rock into liquid, but it refused to hold shape out of his field and quickly became sand, and even in his field, it still felt off, unstable, almost. Izuku grunted and pulled the sand into his field. There had to be some way of making money using his quirk beyond either hero work, as he was too young, or villainy, because no shit. The answer would continue to elude him for weeks further, as would the ability to make what had been liquid back into solid. He had come up with a way to continue his efforts to train with his chakra, by sneaking food from the cafeteria when no one was looking, but even that caused his guts to twist with anxiety. There was one night, after once more failing to accomplish his goals, that Izuku crept out of his room to find a snack, something small to tide him over until the next day. But he paused near the kitchen, his mother's voice drifting down the hall. "I know, Hisashi, but the expenses, I know. I've been trying but I don't think there's any other way." Mitsuki offered to help, and yes. What? No. Why would you say that? He didn't feel hungry after hearing that snippet of conversation, and slunk back to his room feeling like nothing more than a burden. Like a failure. Izuku sat at his desk and thumped his head on the surface, trying not to let his feelings of inadequacy get the better of him, but the tears still gathered. Then he yelped in pain as something hit the back of his head and clattered to the floor. Rubbing the back of his head, he looked down to find an action figure of All Might, wide plastic smile and heroically upraised thumb only adding insult to injury. He sighed as he picked it up and replaced it on his shelf next to the others. Looking at them all, which didn't entirely consist of All Might, just mostly, he felt his stomach churn further. He hadn't always gotten what he had asked for, but his mother, his sweet, kind-hearted mother had done her best to gift him the hero whose ideals he wanted to represent and build as his own. In action figures, posters, lunch boxes, a bedspread, shirts and even a backpack. She had sacrificed much in the way of yen to make him happy, and still it seemed he only took from her. Like a useless little parasite, Izuku felt his heart burn with fury, at himself, at his training, at the cost it put on himself and most importantly his mom. His eyes darted around the room and he realized something. Heroes, even ones with little popularity or very heroic ideals, still had egos. It was needed to be on camera, give speeches or taunt an enemy. How much would they pay for a very high-quality figurine or statuette of themselves? How much would their biggest fans? While he was loath to use his quirk to profit off the ego and admiration of others, there were more important things than his loathing. Like giving back to the woman who had raised him, loved him, and asked for nothing in return. Determination burning within, Izuku sat at his desk, and pulled the sandstone block to the front of his desk. Ellipsis. It was only days later that he ran into a stumbling block. The statuette of the number 2 hero, Endeavor, carved from warm sandstone into his likeness, was very good in his opinion. His field was controlled by his mind, after all, and it was nearing razor sharp. He just didn't know how to sell shit on the internet. Sitting at his computer and tapping his fingers in frustration, Izuku sighed explosively. Simply taking a picture, posting it on a message board and asking, "Any offers?" wouldn't work, but he had no idea how to do it. Izuku. He heard his mom call, and he felt a thrill of anxiety run down his spine. Had Aldera noticed the missing food and figured it out? Had his mother noticed the small snacks he had taken from the kitchen? All those thoughts and more raced through his head even as he stood from his chair and went to the living room, but what he saw there he had no words for. His mother stood by the coffee table, arms behind her back with her cheeks red. She wore the sweater he'd seen in Mitsuki's sketches, and while it had looked great then, in person, it was an entirely different story. In that sweater, which comfortably hugged her body while subtly hinting at some things, with her pink face and shy expression, his mother was absolutely adorable. How do I look?" she asked nervously, peering up at him through her lashes with watery emerald eyes. "It's too cute," his mind thundered as his heart seized. "Must hug. Mom. You look amazing, Mom," he gushed, swooping in to hug her tightly and discovered to his delight that she was even more cuddly and huggable than she looked. He pulled back after a mere 5 minutes and blinked, trying to focus. "But, where'd you get that?" "Well," she folded her hands behind her back and swayed in place, drawing on the floor with the tip of her slipper, completely unaware that such actions were only causing a conniption within her son as he mightily resisted the urge to hug the stuffing out of her once again. "Our budget's been a little tight lately." Izuku felt like he'd been stabbed. I guess I forgot to account just much all the training you were doing would make you hungry. I'm sorry, Izuku. I know you've been trying to cut back for my sake. She sniffed and wiped an errant tear away, and her son wished that he could tear his beating heart from his chest and offer it to her, if only it would remove that sadness from her expression. Then she puffed up and held her arms out, displaying the sweater. Mitsuki-chan's been trying for years to get me to model for her, and, so I am. I'm trying. Anyways, Mom, he asked painfully, feeling tears well in his eyes. I thought you were uncomfortable with it. And she would still do it for my sake. How many sacrifices can one woman make? Inko took a steadying breath and rubbed her hands together, the slightly too long sleeves flapping. I am, she admitted, before adding, and Hisashi isn't a fan of the idea, either. He feels he should be able to support us by himself, but, she drew up, gaze firming. I'm your mother, damn it. A little discomfort shouldn't get in the way of providing for my family. And, really, I remembered that's just part of working. I'd forgotten it after being just a mom for so long, I guess. Izuku sniffed, tears of love pouring from his eyes. Mom. Don't you cry, Izuku, she warned even as her eyes watered and her voice wavered. I'll start crying too, and Mitsuki's coming over to do makeup, and, she swallowed thickly and brushed at her eyes with her sleeves. I'm not sure if I'll get picked up because, you know, she gestured at herself as if she hadn't spent years jogging with her best friend and son, as if she wasn't currently in the best shape of her life, as if she wasn't possibly the cutest thing on the earth right then. But I'll still get paid for my time even if I don't get picked up, so it's not all bad. Mom, Izuku stated firmly, causing her to look up in surprise. If they don't pick you up, they must be blind. You're the most beautiful person in the whole world to me, and if they can't see it, they don't deserve to. Inko let out a shocked gasp and he stepped forward to hug her once again, his mother throwing her arms around him in return. Midoriya. The front door opened and Mitsuki came in, bearing a thick case in one hand. She paused upon seeing the two of them, and Izuku had to admit that she looked good in a sharp black business jacket with a light pink blouse and a pencil skirt, her hair styled into a neat bun. Ah, Izuku-kun, you're here already, too. The lack of a teasing nickname made the two verdant hair havers arch an eyebrow in question. You wanted to see Izuku? Inko asked, eyeing the armored-looking case with trepidation. Is that the makeup? Mitsuki set the heavy case on the table and shook her head. Nope. I realized you'd probably stress out and then the waterworks would turn on and, well, you know. So I figured we'd just do that at the office. This, on the other hand, she tapped the case with her fingernails and fixed Izuku with a look. Your quirk, it's more than just controlling rocks with telekinesis, isn't it? Izuku nodded, inwardly gulping as he hoped she wouldn't spill too much about him to her daughter, even if what he would show was much less than he was capable of. He held a hand out and let his glass collect in his palm, forming into a gauntlet. It's absolute control of any rock and mineral in my field, he admitted, not liking the way her eyes suddenly sharpened and followed the glass sand as it flowed up his sleeve. Why do you ask? The blonde woman reached into her coat and pulled out the quartz heart Izuku made for her, explaining even as the boy in question felt his heart, the real one, jump with glee that she kept his gift on her. It was like a month ago when I was in bed. Like a month ago. Mitsuki was lying in her bed, a book forgotten in her lap as she played with the crystal heart her Lil Bonsai-chan had gifted her after his little incident, spinning it in her palm and watching the crystal catch the light and send arcs dancing around the darkened room. After receiving it, she'd kept it on her at all times, occasionally pulling it out to fidget with it when her mind wandered. Something about it struck her, but she didn't know what or why. It wasn't that it was a bad gift, it was a great one from a genuinely remorseful, sweet boy who turned just the right shade of red with the right teasing who, if he continued on his path, would grow into sweet, cute man with the shape of an athlete, the kind she'd look after and sigh longingly while drinking wine and feeling old. It was just something about the circumstances that struck her, and she couldn't think of why. She thought back to the afternoon, when she'd been badgering Inko about modeling again. Izuku had seemed strangely detached at first glance, but he'd hugged her like she was a steady buoy in a sea of storms and she couldn't help but smile even in remembrance. Just like the crystal he'd given her, he was a pure-hearted boy who'd be good for her, violent, no good. Pure. Mitsuki shot up in bed, eyes wide, distantly glad there was no one to disturb as she held the crystal up to the light and peered through it. She wasn't the most experienced when it came to precious rocks, but finding crystals that were entirely pure rarely if ever happened. And she remembered seeing little specks of dirt on Izuku's desk when he'd given it to her, if he was capable. As she thought, then perhaps she could help them. But first, she needed to make a call. After the call ended, Mitsuki looked at the mirror in her room, and the sharp, satisfied smile on her face was reflected back. 2 birds with 1 stone, she crowed triumphantly, kissing the crystal heart and winking at herself. Tsuki-chan, you are a damn genius. She turned to admire her figure and slapped her hip. A damn sexy genius. Ellipsis. Presently, as it were. But even geniuses can't just borrow precious stones, especially raw ones, without some collateral, Mitsuku admitted, unlatching the case to throw it open and reveal the stones within. Only a few were shiny and cut. The rest were clean, if mired in rock. She leveled a serious look at Izuku, who gulped. If you break these, or somehow ruin them, that'll be on me, okay? I took a risk, for myself, for your mother, and for you. But no pressure. Izuku giggled shrilly as he rubbed his hand together nervously, visibly sweating. Yeah, no pressure. His voice cracked. It's only a case of gems that if I mess up will cost Mitsuki Ba-chan her career and livelihood and possibly friendship with my mother. Yeah. Nothing to be nervous about. He shrilly laughed again, then stopped suddenly, staring at the stones as if they would jump out of the case and bite him if he looked away. I didn't say I wagered my career or anything, Bonsai-chan, the blonde clarified with a smirk. Just a few pieces from my fall collection. Damn bitch Kurenai just doesn't know how friggin' sweaters work. Izuku. Inko laid a hand on his arm, getting his attention. Whatever you decide, she stated seriously, her emerald eyes gazing into his own. I believe in you, okay. Okay. He sighed sharply and nodded. Okay. With trembling fingers he reached into the case and paused above an uncut ruby, then reached over to the sparkling cut gem next to it. Holding it between his hands, Izuku closed his eyes and mentally mapped out the structure within, running his thumb along a facet and feeling it split into 2 pieces. Nodding to himself, he pressed the halves back together and made them whole, setting the stone in the case and taking the uncut rock. Now that he recognized the structure, he could map it out easily and did so, reducing the other, non-ruby rock into sand and gathering it into a small stone that he set aside. That done, he took the stone and the small bits that had been scattered throughout the rest and melded it into one stone, filling in structures and refining until he held a perfectly round, perfectly smooth ruby in his hand. He offered it to Mitsuki, who took a jeweler's magnifying glass and peered through it. Perfect clarity, she muttered, weighing it on a small scale, more carats than expected. The blonde plucked the cut example from the case and offered both to him. Can you make them look the same? Izuku nodded and held the uncut stone in his hand for a few seconds before presenting it back to her, the 2 rocks matching perfectly. Shaping the rock was easy once he knew the structure. Mitsuki smiled and bounced it in her palm. And it was shaped with 0 loss. She turned her eyes on the 2 of them and gestured at the case. Izuku, if you can do the same thing with all the other uncut stones, I think you might find your skills in very high demand. But if people find out about this, Inko interjected nervously, waving a hand at the case and her son, won't they try to find him? Would that put him in danger? Her best friend waved her concern off. There are ways around that, NDAs and such, plus, the firm I contacted would pay through the nose for exclusive retainership. That's something for us to discuss, though, since Izuku's still a kid. We can hash it out later. She turned to Izuku and paused upon seeing him set one of the last gems, an emerald, back in the case. Whoa, you're quick, huh? Izuku grabbed the last one, a sparkling diamond, and shrugged. Once I memorize the structure it's easy, he muttered, focusing on the structures within. Even while mentally mapping them out, he could feel that they were strong, and with the materials making it up, he could see why diamonds were considered unbreakable. He grabbed the uncut diamond and did his thing, putting it back and pausing. Structure. Stability. His eyes went wide and he froze, thinking rapidly. Mitsuki examined them all, her smile becoming wider and more toothy with every look. Well, I'm impressed and I know they will be, too. She grinned and elbowed Inko in the side. Looks like you're both getting jobs, huh? Lazy bunch of slackers. Inko's cheeks puffed out and became red with embarrassment, but whatever she was going to say was cut off as Izuku suddenly shouted, "That's it." Snatched the diamond up and dashed to his room, calling over his shoulder, "1 second. Izuku," his mother called, frowning. "Don't we have to go soon?" Mitsuki wasn't worried. Izuku was too much a good boy to just steal a diamond, especially not in front of someone. And unless he was planning on throwing himself out of a window, there was nowhere for him to go. Go. Nah, the shoot's not for another couple hours. I just wanted to get there early so I can deal with your freakout and still be on top of things. And have enough time to deal with the secondary breakdown before makeup. She said bluntly, leaning back on the couch. Inko pouted and crossed her arms. Tsuki-chan, she moaned, covering her face with her sleeves, making her best friend grin. You don't have to say it like that. Mitsuki arched an eyebrow. What, factually? Inko pouted again. Then she dropped her arms. How'd you get those? She asked seriously, gesturing at the case with her chin. I know you work with clothes. Fashion is more than just clothes, you know, Mitsuki griped. There's the hair, makeup, and necklaces, earrings to tie it all together. Jewelry is important. It's part of the job. I know people, you know. Yes, it works. Mitsuki hummed as the shout echoed through the home and possibly the building. So your son's a screamer, huh? Please never say that again. Yup, regretted it as soon as it came out of my mouth. Izuku came running back to the living room with something clenched in his hand. Mitsuki-ba-chan, you're willing to act as a go-between so we can maintain some level of anonymity, right? He asked in a rush, before remembering he had the diamond in his hand. Yeah, your mom doesn't have a negotiating bone in her body, the blonde blinked, reaching over to poke the other mother in the side. Hey, she squealed, covering her stomach. I held out this long, didn't I? And how much of that was shyness and Hisashi? Mitsuki shot back, closing the case. Yeah, I'm willing to be the middle woman, as it were. Why would you be willing to do the same for things like this? Izuku held out his hand, showing a 10-inch statuette of the number 2 hero, Endeavor. It was made of what looked like sandstone, but matte and orange, red and yellow stone, like living flame had been petrified and sculpted. Mitsuki's eyebrows went up as she took it. I mean, there's always a market for stuff like this. It's not my forte, but I can ask around. She set it on the coffee table and slapped her thighs. All right, Bonsai-chan, I think we might have a very profitable deal coming your way soon, and I gotta get your mama on her way to international superstardom. Inko squealed in fear and clapped her hands over her face. Izuku excitedly hopped forward and gave Mitsuki a big hug. Thank you so much, Mitsuki-ba-chan, you didn't have to do this. She heard him sniffle and ruffled his hair. You better not stain my clothes, brat, she murmured fondly. Yeah, maybe I didn't have to, but hey, sometimes people need a little push to realize their potential. Besides, I couldn't just let my best friend and her cute lil Bonsai-chan go broke, could I? Once they become rich as hell, they'll owe me all the food I could ever eat, mwahaha. She kissed his cheek and pushed him away. But seriously, don't mess up my lines. Izuku then turned to his mother and hugged her, too. You'll be great, Mom. They'll love you. Inko squeaked out thanks. Before Mitsuki picked up the queso jewels and steered the shorter woman to the door. Don't worry, Bonsai-chan. Your mama's gonna come back in one piece. She called. Get ready for a fancy schmancy dinner around 7, too. My treat. Izuku waved and watched them go, his cheeks hurting from smiling so much. Not only had he discovered a way to use the liquid rock, he'd also been shown another method of supporting his family besides the one he'd been trying to use. It had been a very good day. Pepped up on happiness, Izuku skipped to his room and got ready for a run, his eyes falling on the book. Pulling up his socks, he cracked it open and read. Now that you've purified yourself, it is time to begin the forging process. This means training. Luckily for you, everything can be training. Shall we begin? Izuku took a deep breath and felt the glass in his field shiver, whether in glee or trepidation he couldn't tell. But he was ready. Ellipsis. Izuku, age 14, ellipsis. 2 years on, and life had changed for the Midoriya family. Though not in any major way. They lived in the same apartment, they wore the same clothes, if newer, and ate the same food, made of better ingredients. If an appliance needed replacing, it was bought. And that was it. Neither Izuku nor Inko were the type to flaunt what they had, nor eat out every meal or wear the most expensive things. They had what made them comfortable and they were happy with that. Though Izuku did splurge a bit. Weights for working out at home, a dummy for practicing what he knew of Wing Chun, and dies for his statuettes. Also a new phone with a larger music library. Izuku was currently in the 3rd hour of his Saturday run, occasionally sipping from the gallon of chakra inside of him when he felt himself flagging, while listening to classic American rock. English was a complicated, sometimes contradictory and all the time frustrating language to learn, which was why after 2 years of learning the basics, he was still only passable at it. But translating it as he ran made for good mental exercise. He let go of his chakra and began his sprint, feeling his muscles and lungs burn as they pumped, the music pounding in his skull. Sweaty, thirsty and hungry, he stopped near his creek and began to stretch, translating the lyrics as the song ended. I've spent a lifetime planning out your destruction, you are never going to witness another day, a lonely lifetime planning out your destruction, with no other function. Izuku blinked and frowned, looking down at his phone. A song about planning out someone's destruction, by the classic rock band Disturbed. And it was called Run. He couldn't help but chuckle at the irony as he gulped down some water and tore into a protein bar. Then he carefully positioned his arms under his head and lifted his feet into the air. He closed his eyes and started listing the periodic table of elements in his head, letting the sounds of nature and the mindful task combine as he tried to keep his balance. Izuku distantly heard a rustling noise, but it didn't penetrate his mind. His nose pricked with a new scent, sweet like honeyed strawberries with a bitter copper tang for a finish. That was enough to break his concentration. Izuku opened his eyes. His green met a pair of honey gold eyes, the pupil slit like a cat's. "Whatcha doin'?" a feminine voice asked him. His eyes went wide as he realized that not only was someone also balancing on their head to look at him, that person was a girl. Girl, his mind shrieked. Izuku wobbled and fell over with a yelp. Ellipsis. There is another truth, one proven when the tribal humanity grouped together, and further proven by internet communities the world over. Birds of a feather flock together. There's a common adage, misery loves company. Most see it as an expression of contempt. They're miserable and want you to suffer, too, for some form of schadenfreude as a distraction from their own discomfort. Some would prefer to see it another way, the miserable want companionship. Ellipsis. The girl winced as Izuku hit his leg on the way down, gracefully falling out of her headstand while he scrambled to his feet. "What are you doing here?" he asked shrilly. It's a park," she pointed out, running a hand through her hair to remove any errant grass. "Oh, right," Izuku mumbled, face red. "What were you doing?" she asked, gesturing at him. "Were you working out? I can't imagine someone doing a headstand that long for no reason." "Why yeah, I am," he replied, feeling sweat bead his forehead under her attention. "Girl." His brain continued to shriek, his sharp eyes quickly darting over her form. She was lithe but shapely, with ash blonde hair down around her shoulders and those curious honey-colored eyes with a slit to them. Under the shade of the trees and with her head slightly tilted, her pupils were diamond-shaped and brought to mind a cat. Cute girl, his mind added. Self-destruct in 5. Then he caught on to the end of her sentence. "Were you watching me?" She flushed and looked away, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "Why yeah, just for 15 minutes. It had been 20 minutes. She'd been walking through the park, getting some peaceful distance from her home, when she saw his legs pointing towards the sky. Drawn by her curiosity, she'd approached him and observed his rock-steady stand before her eyes were drawn to the edge of his shirt. It had been tucked into his waistband, but before her eyes it slowly started to peel away. Izuku had always been on the lean side, something exacerbated by his daily jogs and later runs. But when he'd become old enough for more serious training tilted towards endurance, he went from having the form of a runner to more of a swimmer's build, thanks in no small part to all the swimming he did. So when the shirt had curled down to reveal a slice of Izuku's pale, muscled abdomen, her eyes had locked onto the sight. "Boy," her mind had whispered, hot boy. She'd spent the next 10 minutes mentally chanting, fall, 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 at the shirt until she had swallowed dryly and realized she was being a bit of a creep. His bod's nice, but what about the face? She had tried to tilt her head to side but that hadn't helped, so she did her own headstand. Then his eyes had snapped open to reveal verdant green irises. Why were you doing that, anyway? She asked, hoping that her burning cheeks weren't too obvious. Are you training for something? Yeah, actually, he admitted, raising his shirt to wipe his sweaty forehead. I'm training to be a hero. Her eyes latched onto his abdomen again. Really? That's a nice body dream. That's a nice dream. Her face fell slightly. I wanted to be a hero, too. Izuku arched an eyebrow at her dismayed countenance. Wanted? He probed lightly. I just can't. She shrugged and put a fake smile on her face. Then her eyes fell and her face went red as her hand shot out to point at his leg. Blood. Her cheeks puffed out with a restrained scream and she spun around, clapping her hands over her eyes. Izuku looked down and found he'd scraped his leg on the tree as he fell, opening several small cuts that were slowly dripping the Carmen life fluid. Oh, he said, unconcerned. After nearly dying in a variety of horrible ways to unlock his chakra, a little stinging pain was nothing. He peeled his shoe and sock off to dip his leg into the creek, getting a squeak from the girl. He looked down at the wound, then back at her cowering form. Is this why you can't be a hero? Izuku asked gently. Because you're afraid of blood. She nodded, still hiding her red face. When I see blood, I just can't help it, it's not very heroic. Izuku pulled a sandy-colored rock into his field and turned it into sand, pasting over the wound in the shape of a band-aid. All covered up, see? He lifted his leg to show her. And, there's nothing unheroic about being afraid, Courage is facing your fears, and heroes have that in spades. I mean, maybe it's something you can train to get over. He trailed off nervously, hoping he hadn't scared her off with a lecture. The way she peeked between her fingers was extremely cute, as was the gusty sigh she released. It also drew his attention to her chest. Rishi Prep, he wondered, noting the school uniform. It's a Saturday. Why you really think so? She asked shyly, playing with her fingers. Yeah, I know so, Izuku said strongly. I believe that anyone can become better if they're willing to try, and I believe in you. Her eyes widened in disbelief at the air of determination around him, at the shine in his dark green eyes. That's a kind of sudden thing to say to someone you don't even know, she murmured, blushing under the weight of his gaze, looking away to play with the hem of her school skirt. Oh, Izuku shrunk into himself and scratched his cheek. Sorry. I'm Izuku, by the way. Midoriya Izuku, Toga Himiko, she introduced herself, bowing slightly before fidgeting with her fingers. Midoriya-san, do you come by here often? Every Saturday, he nodded. Why? You said training might help me, would you? Would you help me? Toga refused to meet his eyes, preferring to watch her foot play with a clump of grass. Speaking of sudden things, I don't know how I could help, he admitted sheepishly, rubbing the back of his neck. Toga slumped in on herself with a sad sigh, and he hurried to add, but don't worry, Toga-san. Izuku gave her a determined look and a thumbs up. I will definitely find a way to help you. She blinked at him, taking in his stance and the light in his eyes. Then she giggled. Okay, Midoriya-kun, she agreed. So, next Saturday. Ellipsis. On the run home, Izuku scoured his mind for an answer to the question, how does one get over a fear of blood? He asked his mom that night over dinner. Mom, how do you get over your fears? Inko paused with a forkful of salad halfway to her mouth. I don't really know, Izuku, she shrugged helplessly. I haven't really gotten over mine, but, being pushed by Mitsuki, wanting to provide, my fears haven't really gone away, but, there are more important things, Izuku gave his mother a loving smile and made her blush in embarrassment. Yeah, I think I do. He consulted the book after dinner, which didn't offer much in the way of getting over fear as much as harnessing it. Fear is one of the most powerful emotions to be leashed for your purposes. Fear of death is very common and useful, as we as a species are coded, in a sense, to fear the cessation of existence. All the ambitions, hopes and dreams, disappear into nothing. That's horrifying. Harnessing the fear of death can provide power when it is needed most. However, there is a greater source. Fear of the loss of a loved one. There within lies the greatest strength, with the greatest cost. Imagine one you love desperately dying in your arms. Imagine the light leaving their eyes, the ragged sigh of life leaving their lips. Imagine they died because of you. Izuku set the book down, his hands shaking. He didn't want to, but his mind imagined it for him. His mother, blood dripping from her lips, green eyes that matches his own dull and glazed. Mitsuki, slumped, lifelessly against a wall, the potent energy of her being puddled under her legs. He felt his heart race, his hands gripped his skull unconsciously, knuckles creaking. It's not real, he reminded himself, forcefully shaking his head. It's not real. The fear eventually dissipated, but the flood of adrenaline did not. Hopping to his feet, Izuku went through the stances of Wing Chun that he knew, the dummy creaking under the strength of his blows. Eventually it all left him, and he slumped at his desk to read some more. Potent, isn't it? Imagine being afraid of spiders. Imagine that fear is stopping you from saving the life of one you love. Doesn't seem so scary now, does it? While it was a tiring lesson to learn, it also didn't help Izuku at all with Toga's fear of blood. Looking it up online brought up a solution, though one he was loath to try it. Perhaps an answer lay somewhere else. Ellipsis. The next Saturday, Toga walked nervously through the park, eyes flicking over the foliage. Is he going to show up? She wondered, swallowing subtly. Did I come on too strong? Her fears weren't relieved when she arrived at the spot she'd found him before. There was no one there, and worse, every patch of slightly darker leaves or grass reminded her of his hair, playing tricks on her eyes. Midoriya-san, she asked out loud, biting her lip in worry. Izuku, she called, feeling her throat tighten in distress. Oh no, I scared him away. Why would he want to meet the weird girl who's afraid of blood? Toga-san, a familiar, friendly voice called from behind, making her spin around. There Izuku was, walking along the creek with a bag in hand, a soaking wet t-shirt grasping at his chest. He gave her a sheepish smile and a wave, his shirt stretching to reveal a tantalizing glimpse of muscled stomach. Sorry I'm late, I was training in the water and lost track of time. Oh, that's okay, she sighed heavily, relief flooding through her chest to pool warmly in her belly. What kind of training? Well, he set his bag down on the grass and sat with a slight squish. I was using water resistance to train my speed in martial arts, so I anchored myself to the river bed up a ways. Toga blinked at him. Underwater. Were you holding your breath the whole time? She asked distantly. Huh. Izuku gave her a confused look. No, my head was above the water. Although, maybe I should put my head underwater to increase my lung capacity. That would also make my ki more efficient if I have to measure how much breath versus how much power. Himiko blinked again, honey eyes staring as the young man sitting by her muttered up a storm. Is he nuts? Izuku Midoriya, you aren't seriously considering that, are you? Izuku looked at her in confusion, like her question was odd. Oh yeah, totally, he answered casually, before giving her a bright smile. That's a really good idea, Toga-san. Thanks. Why yeah, she mumbled, her stomach fluttering at the happiness on his face, feeling her own cheeks redden. Glad I had it. Speaking of, where would you train that? About 20 minutes up the creek where it turns into a river, he replied, pulling an apple from his bag and biting into it. He offered her another. Want one? Sure. Thank you. Toga bit into the crunchy flesh, piercing the red skin with her teeth and spilling a line of the sweet juice from the corner of her lips. The redness, the sweetness, it reminded her of something else sweet and red. She shook her head. So, Midoriya-san, what kind of training do you have in mind? He swallowed his bite and licked his lips. I found a few methods that I think might work, and the one I want to start with is meditation. I don't know how to do that, though, she pointed out. I'll show you. And he did. It took Izuku 2 meetings to get her to let go of her body and sink into the trance, but she eventually succeeded. Ellipsis. 2 weeks later. Quote. Are you still here, Toga-san? He asked gently, sitting with his back to hers. Her eyes were closed and her face was emotionless, but he could feel her heartbeat through his back, and it wasn't in a sleep state. She hummed lowly. Good. I want you to imagine your heart. It's in the center of your chest, between your lungs, he murmured, closing his eyes and doing the same. You can see it. Here it is. It pumps steadily, exchanging blood. It streams through it, a rich dark red, colored by iron and oxygen. Then it branches out into the arteries, then branches further still into innumerable veins. Can you feel the heat, the subtle vibration as it thrums under your skin? It's the feeling of life in your body, the human nature at work. There's nothing to fear, Toga moaned. Izuku blinked and looked at her over his shoulder. Her cheeks were pink, her plump lips pinched between her teeth. Then her eyes flew open and she whipped around to meet his gaze, her face and neck going red as she ducked and covered to avoid him. I'm sorry, she wailed, sniffling into her hands. I just keep seeing it in my mind and then, it gets to me. I'm sorry, Izuku chanced, resting a hand on her shoulder, keeping it there as she relaxed minutely. It's all right, Toga-san, he murmured, any progress is a step forward, all right. And a step forward is still farther than you were before. Yeah, she sighed, rubbing her face. I'm sorry. Don't be, he replied, pushing himself to his feet and checking his phone. I've got to start on the way back, maybe add a few more pounds to make up for lost time. He'd muttered the second part under his breath, but she heard it as clearly as a gunshot. So, next Saturday. Yeah, Toga swallowed, feeling lower than dirt. Don't be discouraged, Toga-san, Izuku said comfortingly. We'll make more progress next week, and the week after that, as long as it takes. Okay, she mumbled, instantly feeling the loss of his warmth as he ran off. He's giving up his training time to help me, she wondered aloud, wrapping her hands around her knees and rocking in place. And you're just lying to him because you're afraid he'll be afraid. She sat there for 2 hours more, recriminating herself and debating in equal measure before she came to a conclusion. The next week, after another failed mediation, as Izuku got up to leave, she reached out and grabbed his wrist. Midoriya-kun, she started, feeling the blood rushing to her cheeks as she licked her lips. I know you're giving up time you could be training to achieve your dream to help me. What? Izuku shrilled, looking shocked. I never said that. You kinda mumbled about lost time last week, she pointed out, feeling her chest seize at the shame on his face. I want to make it up to you, she blurted out. He blinked at her. It's not that much time, Toga-chan, he admitted softly, resting his hand on top of hers. And helping you is my privilege, not a problem. I would like to think of you as AF friend. Me too, Midoriya-kun, she replied, a warmth and lightness in her chest as her fingers squeezed his arm. And friends help their friends, he continued, even through a blinding smile and the beginnings of happy tears. Then let me help you, Toga insisted, pulling herself up to bring them face to face. You just said it yourself. Izuku opened his mouth, then paused. I guess I did, he shrugged sheepishly, before sighing. Okay, Toga-chan, I will accept help, from my friend. Good, she nodded firmly, then darted in to hug him briefly, both of their faces flaming. So, what do you need help with? He took on a thinking pose. Well, I guess my biggest roadblock now is that I'm trying to learn the basics of martial arts, but there's only so much I can do on my own. Toga squinted her eyes in thought. Why don't you go to a dojo? She pointed out an obvious answer. I learn better on my own. He answered quickly, the sheer anxiety on his face making her feel bad. And there would be other people and they'll be friends and I'll be intruding and they'll push me aside and then. What about your friends? She interjected. Izuku shrugged. I don't have any friends, he said so plainly that it must have been true. Then he blushed and fiddled with his fingers. Besides you, I mean. Toga gaped at him. Even I have friends. Izuku. She bit her lip. How can I help you learn martial arts? I know some gymnastics, but that's about it. All you've got to do is correct my stances and make sure I'm doing it right. That's it, he said quickly, picking up his bag and scanning through it before remembering that it only had his snacks and water bottle inside. Oh right, I forgot I didn't bring any of the manuals with me. I guess we can do it next week. I guess, Toga muttered, scratching her cheek. So what should we do today? Izuku scratched his chin. Well, we could med. No, she shouted, making him jump. Sorry, Midoriya-kun, I just think I have too much energy to meditate right now. Maybe something else, he huffed. Okay. How about yoga? Toga blinked at him, then narrowed her eyes. Are you making a joke? At his clueless look she elaborated, you know, Toga, yoga. Izuku thought for a second, then gave an honest chuckle. Oh yeah, I didn't even think about that. He stopped laughing. But do you want to do yoga? She shrugged. Yeah, sure. They stood together in the middle of their little clearing, Izuku leading them in gentle stretches with his eyes closed, Toga watching and matching his stances. Hey, Toga-chan, he murmured, one palm pressed to the grass with the other arching over his head. Once we get you over your fear of blood, unseen, her eye twitched guiltily, we could start training you to be a hero. Would you like that? She sighed deeply, hiding it as an exhalation. I would, Midoriya-kun. I would. Ellipsis. 4 weeks later, Izuku had managed some progress in his learning of martial arts thanks to Toga's help, though it still wasn't as effective as having a sensei. But it was still progress. On the other hand, there was no progress to be had on her front, so they had let it go for the time being. Instead, Izuku had started doing what she was for him, helping her learn Tai Chi. That Saturday, they would spar for the first time. It would be slow, mainly to help them remember the movements and stances. Toga arrived early to their second spot, 20 minutes up the park where the creek enlarged to become a river. She sat herself down at a tree and waited for Izuku to arrive, flicking through a brief manual on Tai Chi to refresh her memory when something splashed in the river. Blinking, she looked up from the book and glanced around. There was no one there. Then her eyes fell on a familiar canvas bag. Did Izuku leave his bag here last time? She wondered. And then Izuku surfaced from the river with a splash, throwing his head back to clear the water from his face. Toga felt her face come alight, her throat suddenly dry as her eyes locked onto his glistening wet form. Droplets trickled down pale skin, clinging to the curves of his muscles as they rippled, his arm coming up to sweep his soaked hair back and expose his face to the sunlight. Himiko whimpered deep in her chest, though some measure of baby fat still stubbornly clung to his cheeks, with the water dripping from his face. Toga could never remember thinking anyone was ever being more attractive to her than in that moment. His eyes seemed darker than she'd ever seen, like abyssal pits ringed with emerald. They fell on her and her toes curled. Then they went wide as his face went red. Toga-chan, he shrieked, arms wrapping around his chest as he ducked. Toga groaned in disappointment. I came early, Midoriya-kun, she announced, giggling to herself as he scrabbled for his shirt. Maybe you should dry off first. He pulled the shirt onto his wet body and coughed to clear the air and move on as quickly as possible. Excited to start, he asked hurriedly, drying his hands off before grabbing a quick snack. Yup, she nodded, hopping to her feet and taking her opening stance. Izuku followed her example before lazily punching at her face. She equally slowly slid a hand out to grasp his wrist, contorting it in such a fashion that, had they been going full speed, would have resulted in him having his arm twisted and him thrown aside. As they sparred, Izuku ran through his plan again. Meditating hadn't worked. If anything, getting her to visualize the blood seemed to make her more sensitive. So it came to the second method. Repeated confrontation, sometimes as a surprise. He only hoped that his actions would help her in the end. To that end, he pulled some of his glass down his sleeve, to the tip of his forefinger and sharpened it into a small, razor-sharp claw. And he gave himself a shallow slice on the side of his thumb. Toga, he shouted, suddenly thrusting his bloody thumb in her face. Blood. She froze, as he expected. Her pupils dilated, her lips parted, and a hint of red suffused her cheeks. That was a bit unexpected. And then he heard her whisper something. It's so beautiful. Izuku blinked in surprise. Then Toga leaned forward and licked the blood from his finger, her eyes closing as she released a pleased sigh and seemed to slump like years of invisible tension had been building up in her that had been relieved all at once. Her eyelids snapped open, her mouth dropping open into a horrified gape as the blood drained from her face. Izuku wasn't much better, staring at her as he was, still holding his thumb up in ironic encouragement. Then her face crumpled and she sank to the ground, eyes welling with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered hoarsely, "I'm so sorry." She covered her face with her sleeves and began to cry into them. "You're not afraid of blood," Izuku realized distantly, blinking. "You like it." His eyes flickered, thoughts racing. So that's why meditation wasn't working. Then he shook his head and looked down at the crying girl in surprise. "Toga, Himiko, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" He crouched down next to her and laid a hand on her shaking back. "Does it have something to do with why you lied about your reaction to blood?" She nodded into her hands. "I'm not supposed to see blood," she whimpered, shakily cupping her face. "When I do, I can't help but admire it. So red, and it smells so good." Himiko gulped audibly and visibly tried to compose herself, standing up on quaking legs. "I'll leave you alone forever now." Izuku jumped, startled. "What? Why?" He realized his shrill shouting wasn't helping, so he cleared his throat. "Why do you think I want you to leave? I drank your blood, and I lied to you," she admitted, wiping her cheeks, "and my quirk is evil. I have to drink blood to transform into other people. And I. Her breath hitched painfully as she tried to voice what she'd been told ever since discovering her power. "I'm a monster, Izuku. The evil little girl who drinks blood. Even my family thinks so." She turned to walk away, only for a large hand to grasp her wrist. Gently, her eyes fluttered closed as she prepared to hear the words of agreement, to hear the abuse. "No offense, Himiko," Izuku started, "but your family sounds like a bunch of assholes. They call you an evil monster because of your quirk. What kind of family does that?" He took a deep breath to settle the furious racing of his heart. "I know it's not my place, but those people can get fucked. I, as your friend, think your quirk isn't evil at all." Himiko looked at him, amazed. She'd never heard Izuku swear even once, so twice in quick succession was quite the surprise. Then she recalled what he said last. You don't think my Q quirk is evil?" She stuttered, daring to feel an ember of hope spark in her chest. "Are you kidding me?" he shouted, an excited smile lighting up his face even as she jumped. "Just imagine the possibilities. A bunch of jerks take a bank hostage for ransom, then one peels off to go to the bathroom and bam. Knock him out, take some of his blood and his appearance, and then when they least expect it, you take them by surprise and save the day. Or, a big villain fight and the last one of them tries to go for distraction, a destructive attack and backs into his friend expecting support and bam. Sedative to the neck and the day is saved. By the crimson wait, the scarlet transforming heroine." Izuku finished happily, eyes sparkling with enthusiasm as he looked at Himiko with a bright grin. "Your quirk's awesome, Toga-chan." Himiko blinked rapidly and licked her dry lips as her heart thumped gladly in her chest. "You really think it's awesome?" she asked tenderly, feeling her lips curling. "Even with the blood?" Izuku snorted. "You ever heard of Glad King?" he asked rhetorically. "Yeah, some people think it's creepy that he uses blood with his quirk, but he's awesome." He took her hand and gazed directly into her eyes. "And so are you. I wouldn't be friends with just anyone, after all." She blinked again, tears welling in her eyes. Izuku," she wailed, throwing her arms around him and burying her face in his shoulder. What? He panicked, hugging her back but also trying to figure what he'd done. "Did I say something wrong?" Himiko snuffled into his collar, a blinding smile on her face. "And no one's ever complimented my quirk before," she admitted, curling against him as he sat down. "You really believe that I can be a hero?" Izuku smiled gently. 100%. "I know you can be an amazing hero," he stated simply. She sniffed and hugged him again. Ellipsis. From that point on, the two of them spent more time together. Not just Saturday, but Sunday as well, and occasionally for lunch during the school week. They both had to hurry to a spot in between their two schools and hurry back in time for class, but neither minded all that much. "That's why I don't need your damn rules, extra." And then as she was posing with her foot on the desk, Itsuko smacked her over the back of her head and told her to be quiet in the library. Izuku finished, smiling as he popped a Narutomaki in his mouth. Toga giggled into her hand, but even behind her fingers he could make out her sharp canines. "If it was me, I woulda kicked the desk," she proclaimed, her honey eyes twinkling as she scooped some more ramen into her mouth. "Wha' happen after?" Bakugo just glared at her, got down and loudly asked for a book on firefighters. He shrugged, plucking a spring roll from a dish and biting it in half. Toga swallowed her bite, looking vaguely disappointed. Well, at least someone stood up to her. With a sigh, she lifted the bowl to her lips and loudly slurped the remainder down. Izuku couldn't help but smile to himself, watching her act less like a demure girl and more like herself. Really, it was only after he'd accidentally forced her to reveal her quirk and her shitty home life that he had started to see the mask she had been wearing before, and only after it had slipped when she really smiled the first time they'd gone for lunch. Even through the warmth suffusing his chest and his face, his mind had zeroed in on her mouth. "I didn't know her canines were like that, even though we've been meeting for like 2 months. He recalled, remembering his realization. When she smiled before, she always kept her mouth closed to hide her teeth. Even when she was happy, she still hid herself. "Nay, Izuku-kun." Toga's voice interrupted his train of thought, her cheeks pink as she grinned at him. "You're staring at me. Do you see something you like?" She winked playfully. He blinked abruptly and realized that he'd been lost in thought while looking at her. "I'm glad I'm your friend, Toga-chan," he said honestly. Her smile became slightly less toothy and more warm, sliding her hand across the table to rest her fingers on his. "Me too, Izuku," she murmured, sitting back with a sigh as he finished off his own bowl. "So, I had an idea on my training. I'll never be as big and strong as you, not without my quirk. I'm gonna need a weapon. I was thinking that, too," he nodded, pulling a notebook out of his backpack and opening it to a page full of scribbled drawings. One page was dominated by a sketch of some kind of clawed gauntlet, though the claws were needles that led to a series of tubes in the back. Arrows pointed at the tubes with little questions squeezed into margins like, sedative, blood storage, and a circle around the tips of the claws reading, painkiller coagulant. My first thought was this claw thing. I think I saw it in a game somewhere. But this second one might be easier to use. Across from the gauntlet was a series of knives. A military-style combat knife, a long, thin stiletto, some kind of folding blade that seemed to go up the arm, a sharply curved knife that reminded her of a talon and a tonto. And a kitchen knife, for some reason. There was another, a curved, serrated blade but that was crossed out with the words, "Too scary," written underneath. Though they were all different styles, they had the same feature each time, a thin needle built into the blade, leading a reservoir in the hilt. Toga was practically salivating at the sight of so many instruments to draw blood, but also pleased that they were all designed with her quirk in mind. "These are beautiful, Izuku-kun," she murmured, dragging a finger down the page as if she could almost feel the cold steel. "I could draw so much blood with these." She blinked and cleared her throat. "You're really good at drawing." Izuku blushed at her smile and scratched the back of his head. "I've got experience," he shrugged, tapping the page of knife drawings. "Anyway, my book, I told you about the book, right?" "Yeah, your red book that no one else can read," she recalled with a nod, grabbing the last spring roll. "I was wondering when you were going to bring that back up." He gave her a searching look, making her blink as the crispy wrap of the roll crunched between her teeth. "I was wondering if you'd remember that I brought it up," he admitted with a shrug. "I wonder if you can see it, too. Anyway, now that I've got the basics down for the martial arts, I read further and found the first set of stances and attacks for the actual fighting style. You know how most martial arts have a style modified for using weapons? Well, Suration's style is built entirely around knives. I'm not joking, even without a knife, it still revolves around knife hand strikes. So you want to teach me how to knife fight?" Toga squealed, cupping her cheeks. "There will be so much blow." Her face froze as she imagined it. Izuku-kun, I don't want to cut you. We can train with rubber knives and paint," he assured her, patting her hand. "So here, take this and look at the knives. Pick one and I'll order a heavy rubber version and then we can learn together, how about that?" She blinked and took the notebook, cradling it to her chest like a treasure. "Are you sure? I mean, we could just find some sticks. It won't put a dent in my savings." Izuku shrugged, piling bills and coins on the table as his phone chimed. It's time we started heading back if we want to get there on time. Yeah, she sighed, brushing hair back from her face, standing with him to exit the establishment. Later, old people, thanks for lunch. I'm not old, the chef yelled from the back as the woman at the counter smiled gently. I'm glad you enjoyed the food, you too. I hope we'll see you again soon. The two teenagers waved and walked out onto the sidewalk, looking in opposite directions but unwilling to get started on the whole leaving part. Izuku, Toga asked, biting her lips as her cheeks went pink. Could you? Yeah, of course, he smiled gently, forming a claw out of glass and giving himself a shallow slice on the inside of his wrist. Her eyes widened, fixing on the minor wound as crimson blood welled forth, a single droplet tracing the curve of his wrist, leaving a light trail of red on his pale skin. Her throat was dry and parched, aching with the need for that sweet scarlet liquid, her tongue darting out to lick her lips. She inched forward, her chest burning with thirst, then she let the drop of blood fall on her tongue. Toga had only drunk a few kinds of blood, mainly snuck from the occasional PE accident and the time they tested her quirk. But she knew, without a doubt, that Izuku's blood tasted the best. It was sweet like syrup, but with a rich depth and a full body that just screamed life. Her tongue traced the trail on his skin up to the cut, and she desired almost nothing more in that moment than to clamp her lips around the wound, pierce the flesh with her teeth and drink until she burst. But Himiko stopped, took a deep breath to burn the scent of his blood and skin into her nose before backing away with a blush. The only thing she desired more than Izuku's blood was his friendship. Thanks, Izuku, she mumbled, her face red. When the cravings got to her, just the memory of his blood would satisfy her for a while. For a lot of things. Izuku covered the little cut with his sand to seal it. On the walk back to Aldera, he'd send a little chakra its way and it wouldn't even be a scar by the time he sat down for class. Of course, Himiko, he said quietly, his face also red. He did just have a pretty girl lick him, and the pure joy and content on her face made him a bit hot under the collar. If you need to, you can have more, you know. I don't mind. She shook her head though. No, but thank you, Izuku. Just a little bit of your blood, and my cravings go away. That's more than enough for me. She checked her phone and sighed, we gotta go. Text me tonight. I will, he nodded, see you tomorrow. They separated with a wave and went about their day. That night, Izuku sat at his desk, sculpting his latest figure into shape, brushing sand together before hardening it into stone under his will. A miniature Uabami posed his desk, holding an arm out and smirking. The only obvious difference between the real one and the statuette, beside being alive, was the fact that the real one had hair. Brows furrowed in concentration, he spun a handful of golden-colored sand in his palm before reducing it to liquid. With both hands and his field fully focused, he shaped the liquid into locks of hair and built a solid crystal structure within, layering it with a coating of dust that made it look just as smooth and silky as the real thing, with the 3 snakes of her quirk rearing back regally. With that done, he pulled open a drawer in his desk, small bags of dust sitting in clearly marked cubbies. It wasn't the first time someone had commissioned him to sculpt a hero, they were celebrities, after all. But it was the first time a hero had commissioned him directly, or as directly as one could through a middleman. Uabami herself had asked for a statue, along with a message all but stating the price paid would depend on the quality. She'd also pretty much stated that money was no issue. That was why Izuku was breaking out the gem dust. Once a month, Mitsuki would arrive at their door with a case of uncut gems and a notarized list of weight, the expected weight of the gem, and an extra bag of junk, rocks with unusable amounts of crystal embedded within. He would spend about an hour removing the impurities and shaping them as the list asked. Most of the time it was easy to meet the expected weight, and fairly often there would be some left over. His first thought had been to add the extra to the stones, but nowhere in the contract he and his mother had spent hours poring over stipulated such a thing. So Izuku collected the extra, stored it away and gave Mitsuki the case of pristine gems back. They would then hang out for another hour or two, watch a movie or get some takeout and talk. And once that time was up, Mitsuki took the case back, and once they'd been verified, a fat check was deposited into Inko's account, then transferred to his own, with a fee deducted for the middleman. The first time Izuku had seen the numbers, he'd fainted. His mom had been no help there, because she did the same. Apparently Mitsuki had played up just how much effort it took for him to do the job, enough that the company was willing to throw a few extra yen on top to retain his exclusive services for next 3 years. If Izuku was content where he was, he could have easily asked for 2 cases a month and lived comfortably on that money alone. As it was, the majority was set aside for emergencies and savings, while the rest went towards food and training materials. All that being said, Izuku carefully picked a bag of amethyst dust and let it swirl between his palms, pushing them forward to engulf the purple dress of the figure, coating it in a layer of glitter. Then he picked dust of the appropriate colors and did the same to her snakes. With that done, it was all done, and Izuku leaned back in his chair with a smile. If he let his mind wander, it was almost like a little Uabami was in the room with him, posing on his desk. He let it sit a while longer to admire his work, before grabbing a secure case and, levitating the figure between his hands, secured it inside and closed the lid. He'd been assured the very expensive case would take his work to the heroine in one piece, with the example given of fine china being thrown from a plane and landing safely. He set it aside and cleaned his station with a brush of his hand, pulling down the red book and cracking it open. Most of the material following his training in martial arts turned his stomach to read, but it was useful. You have done well in forging yourself into a sword. At this point, you will have trained in the basics of the most important styles: striking, grappling, counter and holds. It is now time to take that sword between your hands and snap it in half. Now you no longer have one sword. Now you have 2 knives. And knives are superior to swords, especially for a practitioner of serration. Remember this. Swords are nice. Knives are better. That hurt your hands, didn't it? Breaking your sword. Good. Get used to it. You have more training to do. Izuku looked at the directions for the next set of exercises and winced. Even with his chakra for quick healing and an expanded food budget, what he would have to do next would be uncomfortable. His phone chimed as a text came in. It was from Toga, with a quick snapped picture of the stiletto sketch and a message. I think this one fits me best. XD, it's so pretty, Izuku-kun. I can't wait to start training with it soon. He smiled to himself. Worth it. He looked down at the leather bag that held a rubber pair of every serious knife he'd sketched out a few days ago. Totally worth it. Ellipsis. The next day found the 2 of them at their spot in the park, sitting against a tree trunk as Izuku opened the leather bag to display the weighty rubber knives. Toga carefully reached down and pulled the training stiletto free, weighing it in her palm. This heavier than I thought it would be. They weigh the exact same as the real thing, Izuku informed her, sliding a fake tanto out and balancing it on a finger. I had to answer some weird questions when I got these. Like what? What do you need 8 rubber knives for? He replied with a shrug. I said cosplay. Toga giggled and bounced to her feet, holding the hilt firmly in her hand before imagining a person standing before her. Her eyes narrowed in focus and her hand darted out, nicking the invisible enemy's cheek. As they raised their hand to fend her off, she jabbed the tip into their wrist, ducked a wild swing and drove the blade into their shoulder before dropping and taking out a leg with a stab to the knee. Her grip tightened and she stabbed the blade up at their neck, and paused, sweating slightly. Wow, Toga-chan, Izuku enthused, clapping excitedly. You're a natural. Yeah, she breathed, imagining the nearly crippled imaginary figure that would be mewling in the grass. Injured, bleeding, but still alive. The thought of spilling blood made her own race, but the image her mind painted for her made her stomach turn. Maybe when we actually get this made, we blunt the tip or something so I don't accidentally stab too deep. That's why I was thinking of some kind of coagulant coating on the claws. He nodded in agreement. Also, maybe studying where major arteries are in the body is a good idea. Yeah, so, what about your book? What does it say on knife fighting? She asked, slowly spinning the fake stiletto between her fingers. Izuku reached into his bag and pulled forth the dusty red book, looking very out of place in the peaceful greenery of the park, especially given its contents. Toga sat down next to him as he cracked it open and turned to the proper page. Mostly it talks about how much cooler knives are than every other weapon. Like right here, a simple knife is far more effective than a sword in any other situation than an open battle, and even then, knives can be thrown. Besides, A quick stab in the dark solves far more problems than a tussle in the fields does. Where a gun is loud, a knife is silent. Where a gun is complex, a knife is simple. A knife never has to be taken apart, oiled and reassembled, simply cleaned, sharpened and treated with care. A knife never has to be reloaded, a knife will never jam, a knife will never lose signal, and a knife will never become outmoded. See, Izuku finished, feeling exasperated. He had a feeling that whoever had written the book had a bad experience with guns. What's this part saying here? Toga pointed to a note scribbled into the margin in English. I'm still not good with English, and the translation I got on the internet didn't make much sense, either. He shrugged and recited the translation. Fukin laser swats. And no, I have no idea what that means. Huh. She shrugged and reached over to turn the page. Instead of words, there were only diagrams of a featureless figure holding a knife, followed by more depicting the figure in different stances. The next repeated, except the figure was holding a different knife. Then the next page, then the next page, and so on. Wow, they really like knives, and push daggers, and hidden blades. Yup. Izuku smacked his lips. Alright, let's get started. I'll guide you through the stiletto stance, then you do the same to me, okay? Sure thing, Izuku-kun. Ellipsis. 3 weeks later, the weekends the two spent together revealed much in the way of skills. Obviously, given the differences in body shape and training, Toga would never be as strong or durable as Izuku, and his stamina had stopped making sense some time ago. A typical morning run for him was about 8 miles, a Saturday run was about 12. Without any kind of enhancements from his armor. But what Toga did have was cat-like reflexes, keen sight, an instinctive grasp of balance and gymnastics and pure speed. With her growing skills in Tai Chi and the very basics of Aikido, she would be a very effective heroine in time. It wasn't enough for either of them, though. Izuku had only just begun the basic exercises to learning the art of unarmed serration, and Toga had decided to increase her speed by training her moves underwater. Nay, Izuku-kun, she drawled, slowly stepping out from behind a tree in a school-issued one-piece swimsuit with a towel thrown over her shoulder. If you wanted to see me in less clothing, all you had to do was ask Tilda. His face went red, and he couldn't stop his eyes as they roamed over her form. She was still alive, the swimsuit bearing almost the entirety of her long, slender legs and arms, but they had visible tone to them, as did her shoulders and what he could see of her stomach under the suit. Why, you don't have to say it like that, we both know it's just training. He squeaked, before clearing his throat. You do look good, Toga-chan. I know, she chirped cheerfully, skipping over to the river and hanging her towel on a branch. You're not just going to watch me the whole time, are you? I don't mind if you peek once or twice, or 3 times, or, nope, you can watch me the whole time, I don't mind. I'll keep an eye on you, he assured her, tucking his shirt into his waistband, and if you need anything, just say something. I will, she replied, shivering slightly as she stepped into the cool water. The key to the training involved finding just the right spot where one had to balance on the rocks of the bed, while also not floating away and facing into the current for the proper resistance. Toga had to grip the surface of the large rocks with her feet to keep herself from being dragged away, and with only 3 repetitions of her kata's down, she was already tiring. But one of the good things about exercising in a river is that it only takes a bit of maneuvering to relax. As she floated on her back, Toga turned her eyes on her best friend and training buddy and licked her lips with a giggle. Izuku had apparently decided that his shirt wouldn't stay up and so had elected to toss it aside while he exercised, which in this case, was doing push-ups from a handstand. The way his legs wobbled and his teeth were clenched exemplified the difficulty of his work, if one weren't to notice the rivulets of sweat pouring down his body. She sighed, eyes lazily tracing taut muscles as he dipped and shakily rose with a groan. Now that right there, is a tasty boy. And she wasn't even referring to his blood. She narrowed her eyes in thought, the errant idea of his blood brought to mind the few times he'd cut himself for her needs. Blood aside, she wasn't entirely sure just how he'd cut his skin besides a subtle flicker. What is his quirk, anyway? She wondered, tilting her head curiously. With the way he works his body and mind, some kind of aura. An aural field, maybe. Telekinetic. Generated by the body, controlled by the mind. Hey, Izuku. Toga called, humming low in her chest as he bent out of his form, face flushed and panting. What's your quirk? He blinked at her in confusion. I haven't told you yet. He asked. She shook her head. It's called rock field. I can telekinetically control rocks in a 2-inch field around my body. Huh. She blinked, unwilling to voice the thought of well that's kinda useless, when something about his words struck her. What kinda control? Izuku smiled at her, crawling over so that he was near her face. He grabbed a handful of pebbles which began to orbit his hand like a miniature solar system. At first, everyone thought this is all I could do, myself included, he admitted, making the pebbles speed up until they nearly blurred. You asked what kind of control? He smirked, and Toga was only semi-glad most of her body was underwater. Absolute control. The multitude of pebbles shivered before bursting into sand, swirling in his palm like a miniature tornado before it froze, becoming solid, and then melted. It flowed around his hand before solidifying into a gauntlet. Izuku turned, found a large rock resting on the bank, and punched it. It shattered into pieces, scattering shards of stone in the water. Toga blinked, looking between the remnants of the rock and the glove on his hand. Wow, she muttered, taking his hand and running her fingers over the armor. It's all one piece. Wait, does this mean you can control glass, too? Yeah, he nodded, and the resistance bands around his thighs scattered into sand, crawled up his arm and came together with the gauntlet to cover his whole arm. I've been using it for resistance training pretty much every day. She had the sudden image of that glass gauntlet becoming a storm of razor-sharp shards, spinning around his hand like a drill bit before it was plunged through a body, and then the image abruptly stopped because it was sickening. Pretty much every day. How much? Except on Sundays, those are for rest. And today's a light day, so, about 25 kilos. Normally, it's 50, Izuku shrugged and returned the glass to the bands, pulling the rock into his hand. Toga blinked at him. Do you wear them while you're running? She asked cautiously, before thinking, do you wear them doing the water training, too? He nodded. Yeah, for everything except sleeping and on Sundays. She stared at him. Izuku, I think you might be a little nuts. Izuku simply shrugged. I just want to be the best me I can be. If that makes me a little nuts, well, just call me an anorexic squirrel. He held his hands close enough the field intersected with itself and pulled the sand together into a little 4-inch figure of her, setting it on the bank of the river. Toga picked it up and looked closely, amazed by the level of detail he'd managed in a few seconds. I want to be the best me, too, she smiled up at him. Then let's get to it. Ellipsis. The next week, Toga huffed as she ran for the park, her swimsuit pinching a little under her uniform, the bag over her shoulder bouncing against her hip with every stride. She was running late, and the reason for her tardiness was securely stuffed in the bag, a homemade bento, personally put together by her, for her and Izuku to share. Onigiri, with tuna and pickled radish, 3 for both, with a sliced apple, 2 red bean donuts and a can of chilled green tea to wash it down. She'd spent over an hour making the rice and shaping the rice balls into hearts and making sure the presentation was perfect before noticing the time. She dashed into the clearing near the river and bent over, panting. Her eyes found Izuku's back as he faced a tree, the trunk subtly shaking as he punched it, or so she assumed. She couldn't actually see, but his shoulders were moving and he was sharply exhaling each time. Izuku-kun. He jumped and spun around, quickly hiding his hands behind his back and giving her what he hoped wasn't a pained smile. Toga-chan. He greeted her with surprise. I thought you weren't coming today. Toga was immediately suspicious. Of course not. I woulda texted or something. Not left ya hanging. What are you hiding? Her eyelids fluttered closed as she detected the faintest whiff of that sweet liquid she desired. Izuku's blood. Then her eyes opened. Izuku. Why can I smell your blood? He sighed and revealed his hands to her gaze. The tips of his fingers were bruised and ragged, drops of blood leaking from where the rough bark had scraped away the skin. It's part of the training, he hastily explained at her horrified look, nodding at the tree behind him and the visible, blood-specked dent in the wood. I have to condition my fingers, hands and wrists to the point that I can strike the tree and sink my hand up to the knuckles without hurting myself. She took his hands tenderly, wincing as he hissed at her touch. Shit, Izuku, she murmured, won't this mess up your hands? Like, forever. Izuku's eyes darted to the book in his bag. No. Just as long as I treat them often, it'll be fine. Well no, not fine, but acceptable. And painful. Toga arched an eyebrow at him. Does it have anything to do with how you seem to have so much energy? Like when you do a bunch of exercises, close your eyes and then suddenly you're fine. Yeah, are you ever going to teach it to me? Izuku winced. It's incredibly dangerous, Himiko. I didn't know how bad it could have been until after, but, what if I don't teach you right? What if you die because of me? His fingers wrapped around hers, the stress clear in his face. She sighed. That makes some kind of sense. I guess you'll just have to teach me other stuff until you're confident enough to show me. Inwardly, Toga noticed that even though he'd been bleeding freely the whole conversation, not once had she felt the desire to drink. Have you been hiding this part from me? He nodded. I didn't want to, bleed all over the place, like I'm doing right now. I'm so sorry. He moved over to the river and dipped his hands in to clean them, covering the wounds in his sand. I didn't want to dangle my blood in front of you, I get that, she nodded, sitting next to him and pulling out the bento. I'm late because I was making food for us. As she cracked open the lid, Izuku's eyes went wide. Wow, Toga-chan, you must have worked really hard on that. It looks really good. She giggled and lifted one of the rice balls to his mouth. Thanks, Izuku-kun. I hope it tastes good, too. Here, say, ah. He blushed but did as commanded, leaning down to take a bite. She grinned as he hummed contentedly. Do you like it? I love it, Izuku groaned. The chewiness of the fish mixed perfectly with the crunch and spice of the radish. You're a good cook, Toga-chan. He blinked upon noticing what the rice balls were shaped like. Hearts. Because IWUV Izuku-chan tilde. Toga sang girlishly, giggling as his face went red. And if you think about it, me feeding you these is pretty much me giving you my heart. Izuku's face might as well have been a beacon. Why you can't just say such things, Toga-chan, he muttered, looking away bashfully. Of course I can, she said softly, her fingers grasping his wrist, peering up at him through her eyelashes. Because they're true. Then she reached up and kissed his cheek. Now let me feed you while you tell me how much you like my food. Say. Ah. Ellipsis. The next week, as Izuku rested off his latest round of conditioning, a thought peeked in his mind. Hey, Toga-chan. The girl, clad in her swimsuit and idly waiting for her muscles to stop feeling so sore, looked up in interest. Do you train with your quirk? She looked away, brushing a damp strand of hair away from her face. I try, but it's hard to do. Why's that? Because blood is the source of transforming, and my quirk's like a car, I guess. If I don't have enough in the tank, the engine won't start. She shrugged. And the only time I get blood is when you give it to me. Which I love, don't get me wrong, but I just don't have enough to seriously train with it. Izuku frowned, rubbing his wrist. Do you know how long the amount I give you lasts? How much would you need? Toga rolled over on the bank, kicking her feet in the water in thought. I don't know, maybe half an hour. I've never really had a lot of blood at once. Her nose twitched as the sweet scent of her favorite drink wafted in. She spun around to find Izuku having scooted closer, holding his arm out towards her, a deep, short cut across his wrist bleeding freely. Izuku, here, he offered innocently, drink up. I said I would help you train to be a hero, and I meant it. She couldn't help but lick her lips, fingers digging into the river bank as she resisted the urge to dive on him. But Izuku, what if I drink too much? You won't, he said confidently. Toga swallowed audibly and frowned. You don't know that. Yes, I do, she scowled. No, you don't, he frowned at her. Himiko, I trust you. You won't hurt me. If it makes you feel better, I'll tell you when I'm feeling lightheaded, and I've got snacks in case I do. Now please, drink. So I didn't cut myself for nothing. Toga bit her lip and felt her heart throb in her chest as tears welled in her eyes. Okay, she nodded, scooting up to the grass on her knees and gently taking his arm with her hands. Here I go, she murmured, leaning forward. Her tongue, soft and slick, slid up his skin, gathering the trail of blood until she touched the cut in her lips, moist and plump, parted to tenderly seal her mouth to the wound. Then, She began to drink. Himiko had thought the brief tastes of his blood had been the best thing she'd ever had. But a few drops don't compare to a mouthful. His blood was rich and full of energy and heat that spilled down her throat to pool in her belly before rushing up to her cheeks and other places. It's so warm, she noted lazily, a haze of comfort and warmth descending on her like the soul of a blanket. Izuku is so warm. Even though part of her wanted to sink her teeth into his flesh and suck until he was dry, it was easily suppressed by the rest. With her lips on him, his blood in her belly, she couldn't help what she felt. I really do love you, Izuku. She pulled her lips away from his arm and rested her head against his chest, the comforting thump of his heart against her ear joining with the fullness and warmth suffusing her, and she sighed happily. He wrapped her in a gentle embrace and she never wanted to move from her spot again. Are you okay? Izuku rumbled as Toga curled further into his lap and nuzzled his chest like a giant cat that was also a cute girl and his best friend. I'm perfect, she mumbled with a smile. How are you? A little dizzy. Nothing else, he assured, carefully rubbing her shoulder. Just like I said, you didn't hurt me. Toga hummed agreeably. Can we stay like this for a little while? Yeah, and so they did, for about 15 minutes. Do you want to show me now? Izuku asked later. He'd stopped feeling dizzy a few minutes ago and while sitting and cuddling with Toga was nice, he also really wanted to see her quirk in action. Okay. Toga slipped out of his embrace and stretched with a pleased groan, bringing attention to the fact that she, in fact, a girl who was also, in fact, wearing a tight swimsuit. Izuku made a fine impression of a tomato. Then she reached for the straps on her shoulders and started pulling them down. Izuku nearly fainted from all the blood rushing to his head, his mouth falling open as more of her smooth, creamy skin was bared to his gaze. He clapped a hand to his eyes and spun around. "WWWW, what are you doing?" he cried, his heart beating in his cheeks. She peeked at him over her shoulder, a sly grin on her lips. "Well, when I transform into you, I won't fit in my swimsuit anymore, will I? I can transform into you wearing your clothes, but it'll destroy mine, too. Either way, I'm getting naked. You don't have to turn away, you know. I don't mind, Izuku-kun. It's improper," he squeaked, and taking pity on him, Toga walked behind a tree and disrobed. There was a sound he couldn't identify, followed by footsteps on the grass. Turning around, he beheld himself wearing the same clothes he was currently in, standing across from him. "Wow," Izuku breathed, stepping around her and examining his own face. "It's like looking in a mirror." "More than just looking, Izuku-kun," his own voice commented as Toga smiled at him, looking around the clearing. "So this is what it's like to be tall, and strong, too." "That's so amazing, Toga-chan," he enthused, taking her hand and squeezing it. "It feels like me, too. I bet if you met my mom like this, she wouldn't be able to tell us apart." She smiled proudly, chest puffing out from his praise. "You wanna see something cool?" Toga closed her eyes, brows furrowing in concentration. Then her body rippled and changed, losing the broadness of Izuku and gaining a curvier shape. Then, standing him in a PE uniform was an athletic girl with short black hair and blue eyes. "Now I'm this girl, wow," Izuku enthused, squeezing her shoulders. "The bone and muscle structures changed entirely, so you can change forms without changing back. How do you get her blood? Do you feel tired? Do you need more blood?" Toga blinked under the barrage of questions. Yes. We were in PE and she took a soccer ball to the face. I had some tissues and escorted her to the nurse. I feel really good, actually. Like I've got a ton of energy." She bounced happily in place and her slightly bustier form bounced with her. She reached up and cupped her chest, jiggling herself experimentally. "Huh. This is a nice rack. Toga-chan, please don't." Izuku covered his red face, peeking at her through his fingers. "Do you need more blood, though?" Himiko gave him the warmest smile. "I don't think I can ever have enough of your blood, Izuku," she said honestly. "But no, I'm good. I feel like I could keep this up all day, maybe even longer." "All right then," Izuku announced, clapping his hands firmly. "It's decided. We're gonna train your quirk, Toga-chan. Before we start the other stuff, you can have all the blood you need and then we can train until we drop." She gasped excitedly, but sobered quickly. Are you sure, though? I don't want to scar you. If it helps you become the best you possible, I'd wear that scar with pride, Izuku said, eyes sharp and serious. Toga felt her heart thump and heat in her cheeks, but couldn't help but fret. What if? You know I crave blood, what if you letting me have a lot means they get worse? He narrowed his eyes in thought. I think it'll be the opposite, he admitted after a minute. When I repress my quirk, well, it took me a long time to get over the discomfort, and every time I let it go, it's a relief. Maybe actually using it will help. Our quirks are a part of us, after all. Not using it is like not using your tongue when you eat. Toga worried a lip between her teeth as she thought, but eventually nodded. Okay, she agreed, giving him a soulful look with her blue eyes. If the opposite happens, though, you'll stop me, right? And still be my friend. He nodded once. I'd never turn my back on you, Himiko. She straightened up with a smile. All right then, let's train my quirk. Her eyes shut and her form rippled, losing color until it collapsed into a gray sludge that dripped off her body. Her naked body. Izuku fainted. Ellipsis. The next week, technically 5 days, but it was the Thursday the following week, which made it next week, but not 7 days. Just so it's clear, Izuku arrived at the ramen house and gave the woman behind the counter a smile. Even though her eyes lacked pupils, being a milky white tinted with lavender, she could still see and returned his greeting with a gentle smile of her own, nodding to the table in the corner. Toga was already there and gave him an excited wave. She already ordered, the woman said softly. Thanks, Oni-san. He strode over to the table and sat next to his best friend, taking in her bright smile and the gleeful luster to her skin. So, how have your cravings been? He asked leadingly, a smile pulling at his lips. She lightly slapped his bicep, her hand staying to squeeze. They've been great. I haven't looked at any of the other students and thought of them as blood bags at all. She shrugged contritely. I mean, I still have 'em, but they're a lot easier to manage. Her hand slid down his arm to intertwine their fingers. Maybe even with time. So this is where you've been getting to. Deku Koishi, a raspy feminine voice interrupted, their heads snapping to the source. Bakugo Katsuki stood by the counter, hands in her pockets as her red eyes glared at them. Ka Bakugo, Izuku yelped in surprise, before he frowned. Quote. Did you follow me? It's not hard to notice the school's biggest nerd running off every day, she replied, eyes darting to Toga and the patch on the breast of her jacket. No one at Aldera wants to hang with you, so you go to another school. Her eyes met Izuku's. Does she know how worthless you are? Toga slammed her hand on the table and stood up so fast her chair went skittering back. All she needs to know is that you're a bitch. Her eyes were wide with fury, teeth bared in a snarl. The fuck did you say to me, you damn extra? Bakugo snarled, hands ripped out of her pockets with tiny explosions popping in her palms. You wanna die? Toga refused to be intimidated, glaring into the other girl's eyes. No, what I want is for you to fuck off. She squeezed Izuku's trembling hand. You're interrupting our date. Bakugo dropped her hands, eyes going wide in surprise. Date, she mumbled, ruby eyes flicking down to their intertwined fingers, up to Izuku's red face but silent mouth and Toga's victorious smirk. Then the owners emerged from the back, carrying their order. The chef, a tall man with spiky blonde hair, bright blue eyes and whisker-like scars on his cheeks, looked between the two parties before fixing on Izuku and Toga. You two causing trouble, he growled. No, Toga said firmly. Yeah, it would be weird if you were, the chef agreed cordially, before arching an eyebrow at the stunned Bakugo. How about you? The question snapped the explosive blonde out of her state, a scowl coming to her face as she shoved her hands in her pockets and turned to the door. I'm leaving, she grumbled, stomping from the premises. They watched her go. Bye. Leaving. The chef called cheerfully. Hope you buy something next time. His wife sighed but still smiled. Always with the dad jokes, Naruto-kun. I'm allowed, he returned, setting their bowls on the table as his wife set out a pot of tea and 2 cups. Enjoy the food, kids. We will, Toga replied with a smile, turning to her ramen. Izuku squeezed her hand and she looked at his blushing face. Yeah, date, he wheezed, eyes wide. Friends go on dates, don't they? She asked innocently, giggling as he sighed and noting the hint of disappointment it carried. Right, he nodded, grabbing his chopsticks. After they finished and with the promise of another meeting the next day, Toga stayed behind to settle the bill. Toga-chan, if you seriously like Izuku-kun, then you shouldn't wait, Hinata said in a serious whisper. Take it from me, I waited forever for Naruto to notice me when I should have been direct. Trust me, it's not worth stringing yourself along. Yeah, I had no idea until she told me. Naruto called from the kitchen. I'll think about it, Toga promised with a smile. Ellipsis. The second Saturday from then. Izuku wiped the rain from his face as he ran, circulating his chakra to keep him warm as he did. Working my body, mind and chakra all at once. That's what I call efficiency. He cleaned his face again, distantly glad he didn't wear glasses. I'm glad Toga-chan took the day off, I wouldn't want her to get sick. He hadn't gotten a text from her letting him know she was on her way to their spot, so he assumed she was staying home out of the rain. One missed day wouldn't matter in the long run, they still had a year and a half until the UA entrance exam. He arrived at their spot, lightly steaming and breathing hard. The constant, albeit small use of his chakra had taken more out of him than he'd expected, so he had a hand in his bag, feeling for an apple when he saw it. At the base of the tree they sat under to rest, was a lump of something gray. Something gray and wet, something gray and wet and shivering. Help! Papa Roach, for the mood. Izuku cautiously approached the lump and reached out with a hand. Hey! The lump jumped violently, turning scared, red-rimmed, honey-colored cat eyes on him. Izuku! A sodden, miserable Toga, Himiko wailed, jumping on him. Himiko! He blinked, arms automatically wrapping around her. You're here. He felt her shiver against him and became aware of just how cold and soaked she was. How long have you been here? Since last NN night, she stuttered into his ear, teeth chattering as she buried her freezing face into his shoulder. Izuku had many questions running through his mind, but all of them were drowned out by the quiet sobs, the pouring rain and her violent shivering. I'm taking you home, he announced, his glass emerging from under his clothes to wrap around his lower body. Tucking her securely into his chest, he took off running. The miles were eaten by his powered strides, the thankfully empty sidewalk allowing him a straight shot to his home. He took to the walls instead of the stairs, zipping up the stories to his door, barely managing to slow down in time to not barrel through the door. Mom! He shouted, throwing the door open. Mom! There was no reply. She's not here, he muttered to himself, running over first aid in his mind. What do you do when someone's been out in the rain too long? Get them out of their clothes and get them dry and heat them up. He took them to the bathroom, setting her feet down on the floor, but her arms refused to uncurl from his neck. Himiko, you gotta let go real quick, I need to get you a towel and some clothes, he explained hurriedly. Don't leave me, she mumbled into his shoulder, squeezing fresh tears from her tired eyes. I'm not, I swear, he replied, nuzzling her cheek in hopes of relaying his sincerity. I will be right back, I swear on our friendship. She took a shuddering breath and nodded, releasing her arms and stepping back. Even as he left the bathroom, he heard her release a tiny whimper that jammed a shot of cold adrenaline straight into the base of his skull. He rushed into his room, pulling up the drawers in his dresser in search of clothes. He grabbed a pair of sweatpants and a clean shirt for himself, but nothing he had would fit Toga's smaller frame. Growling to himself, he pushed open his mom's door and looked through her clothes. An old shirt and a new pair of sweatpants fit the bill, so he snatched them up, stopped at the hall closet to grab a pair of towels and dashed back into the bathroom. Himiko was standing by the sink, holding onto it as her legs wobbled. As soon as had cleared the frame, she held her arms out pleadingly and he darted towards her. Come on, we gotta get you out of these clothes, he muttered, hands working at the buttons on her shirt, peeling it off her arms before telling her, arms up, while he pulled her undershirt up and away then bent to pull her skirt and underwear down as she worked on her bra. He didn't notice her nudity. It didn't even register. He grabbed a towel and wrapped it around her shoulders, bending down again. Foot, he ordered, letting her balance on his shoulders as he stripped her soaking socks off. No shoes, he noted, using the towel to dry her skin pebbled with goosebumps. Then he grabbed the pants and held them out. Come on, in we go, he said softly, helping her slide her legs inside before pulling the shirt over her head. "All right, hang tight." Izuku quickly stripped his clothes, dried himself off and pulled on his clean, dry pair before scooping Toga up in his arms and carrying her to the couch, setting her in his lap and wrapping them both in the blanket that decorated the back. He pulled her shivering form into his arms and tucked her head under his chin. She was still shivering but less so, clinging to him tightly. He held her fast in his embrace, rocking in place. His mind raced as she slowly stopped shaking and began to fall still. "Himiko," he whispered, thinking of her teeth. She often spoke of how drinking his blood seemed to fill her with energy. She groaned in question as he carefully maneuvered her into the position he wanted, her breath brushing over his collar. "Drink from me, okay? Can you do that for me, please?" He felt her gasp, her clammy fingers tightening on his arm. "Zuku, I think it'll make you feel better, okay? Please, drink." Her lips pressed against his throat, an agreeing hum vibrating against him. She licked his skin, her saliva leaving a subtle tingle before her teeth pierced into his vein. Only a slight tightening around Izuku's eyes showed his discomfort, focused as he was on rubbing her back. With a jolt, he had an idea. Closing his eyes, he tapped his chakra and let it fill his body. Immediately, Himiko perked up, a quiet moan thrumming in her chest, her delicate fingers squeezing his shoulder as she drank deep from his heart. He blinked, hunger aching in his stomach and the edges of his vision blurred. He groaned in discomfort but made no move to push her away. He didn't have to, as she pulled away from his neck with a lingering lick before snuggling into his chest. Izuku directed his sand to the wound to cover it, but nothing further. Any more use of his chakra, and his stomach felt like it would eat itself. They lay together under the blanket for a long time, the world outside growing dark. Eventually, Himiko blinked and shuffled, awakening from what felt like the best nap of her life and found herself looking into Izuku's emerald eyes. She wondered why she couldn't remember the events leading up to a scene out of her dreams, until she did. "Hey, Izuku," she mumbled, feeling a shameful heat swelling in her cheeks. "Hey, Himiko," he replied, brushing a hand along her jaw. "You scared the shit out of me, you know." "I'm sorry," she whimpered, her sore tear ducts aching as tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't mean to. You're safe now, and that's all that matters," he whispered, pressing his lips to her forehead. "What happened, Himiko? Why were you at our spot all night?" Himiko swallowed painfully, her eyes prickling. "I ran away," she admitted in a hoarse sigh. She could see the "why" in his eyes. "Why didn't you come here? Or call me?" he asked, leaving his other question aside. She shrugged helplessly. "I don't know where you live, and I left my phone behind. I couldn't go back, so I just went to the only place I could think of." "Okay," he nodded, hugging her gently. "I'm glad I found you when I did, and I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner." "Don't be," she snuggled into his chest, blinking away the moisture in her eyes. "I'm glad you found me at all." Izuku hummed in agreement and let it sit, holding her tight. Eventually, though, the question had to be asked. "Himiko," she drew in on herself in preparation, why did?" Izuku's stomach roared with hunger, making the couch and Himiko literally rattle from the force. There was a second of silence, and then she let out a hysterical little giggle. That broke the tension neater than All Might punching spun sugar, and Izuku couldn't help but break out into laughter, with his best friend joining in shortly. "You need to feed that beast before it eats me," she teased, reaching an arm between them to pat his belly. "All right, I'll make something," he grinned and maneuvered himself out of her grasp and off the couch. "Something for both of us." She nodded, snuggling into the remnants of his warmth with the blanket bunched up around her neck, cat-like eyes wide and innocent. It was painfully adorable. Izuku put together a couple of hearty sandwiches, chomping down on two of them as the kettle heated up and making two more as it whistled. With two plates balanced on one arm and 2 mugs of hot chocolate in the other, he sat by Himiko and handed her one of each. "Here, thanks," she sighed as she bit into the meal, her leg pressing against his as they sat together and enjoyed a late lunch. Soon enough the sandwiches were gone and they snuggled together with mugs of cocoa as it drizzled miserably outside. Himiko licked her lips and rested her head on his shoulder, curling around her mug. "It's time, isn't it? Why did you run away, Himiko?" Izuku asked softly, The front door closed softly. She bit her lip and squeezed her eyes shut, a quiet whimper escaping from her chest. I had dinner with my family, she finally murmured, her eyes downcast. Ever since they found out about my quirk, I usually eat alone, but I've been feeling really good about myself. I thought, maybe, if I told them, showed them how hard I was training to be a hero, then, maybe, her breath hitched in a lone, painful tear traced down her cheek. Maybe they wouldn't call me a monster. The handle of Izuku's mug cracked in his grip, and he set it aside. Then what? They laughed at me, she whispered hoarsely. They said, a monstrous girl like you with an evil quirk will never be a hero. If you're lucky, they'll just throw you in Tartarus. And then, I shouted at them. I told them about you, how you believe in me, how you trust me, how you're training me to be a hero. Her eyes opened. The light of pure fury in her honey eyes. They said either you were evil too, or that a boy would say anything to get in a girl's panties, even if they're a monster. Her best friend exhaled harshly, his fingers gentle as he pried the mug from her grip and embraced her. His heart thundered in chest, the urge to find and punish the ones who wounded her so deeply racing through his veins like liquid fire. Hamiko, he muttered into her hair, trying to translate his anger into love for the girl in his arms. I hate your family. So goddamn much. I've never felt so angry as I do now, because those assholes, your family, said those things to you and you deserve nothing less than their admiration. Hamiko extracted her arms from his and clasped his face between her hands, forcing him to look into her eyes. Please, Izuku, don't hate them, she pleaded, her thumb brushing away an anguished tear. They aren't worth it. They aren't worth anything. After they said that, I may have yelled at them, or screamed at the top of my lungs. I don't remember everything I said, but I think I told them to never speak about you like that again. I remember telling them they aren't my family, and they agreed. And then I was running down the street, without even my shoes, and my father's voice echoing after me. He said to never come back, because he'll call the cops on me. He said what? They jumped as a shout rang out behind them, Izuku leaping from the couch into a corner, tucking her against his chest and baring his back to the sound, only to peek over his shoulder and realize that his mother and Mitsuki had been standing there. Inko was pale but swiftly reddening, like raspberry jam bleeding into yogurt, while Mitsuki's eyes were blazing like she was the one with the quirk to generate explosions. You. The elder Bakugo pointed a finger at the younger girl, who flinched back against Izuku. Tell me where you live. Inko grabbed her best friend's arm. Mitsuki, you can't just ask that. She protested, cheeks red, before turning back to the teens. Toga Hamiko-chan, right. Izuku talks about you all the time. Hamiko glanced at Izuku, who simply nodded in agreement. It's all right, dear, just tell me your parents' names so I can call them, all right. Also whether they want to be buried or cremated. Hamiko blinked. What? Then she blinked again as a picture was taken. What? Mitsuki tapped her screen impatiently, waiting for whatever she'd just done to finish. Toga, she muttered, before her phone dinged. Aha, there they are. Come on Inko, it's mothering time. She spun on her heel and stalked off. Mitsuki, wait, at least make sure, Inko called, making to follow before a quiet voice called her attention. Mom, Izuku asked quietly, not in a defensive position anymore but holding on to his best friend all the same, can Hamiko stay with us? His mother nodded firmly. Of course. She smiled gently at the girl. You're always welcome here, Toga-chan. You can share my room with me until we figure something out, okay? If I have my way, you won't have to see your parents again, and they won't see anything but the inside of an urn. With that oddly cheerful death threat hanging in the air, she left them there. The teenagers blinked, suddenly with company and just as suddenly alone again, before Hamiko murmured, is that what mothers are supposed to be like? To herself. Well, my mom's not usually like that, Izuku shrugged, carrying her back to the couch. But protective, fierce and caring about kids. Yeah, moms are supposed to be like that. It's nice, she whispered, resting her head on his chest. So, I'm staying with you. As long as you want, he assured. Will I get to see you every morning when I open my eyes? And every night before I close them. Hamiko clasped his hands in hers, gazing up at him with soft honey eyes. Until you get tired of seeing me, Izuku swore, raising her hands to his lips and kissing her knuckles. She closed her eyes and relaxed against him, releasing a long, content sigh. Good. They sat there for several long minutes, simply basking in the presence of the other. I'm still hungry. I could eat, she shrugged, patting her stomach. I'm not super hungry, though. Her eyes widened as she recalled just why she felt like that. I bit you. Izuku nodded and bore his neck, with 2 small crescent pink marks in his skin. I asked you to. Himiko sniffed, a beaming grin curling her lips. I didn't know you were kinky. Izuku-kun tilde, she teased, squeezing his hand. Is my virtue safe from such a deviant? You'll always be safe with me, he replied with a smile. You want some ramen? Yes please. Ellipsis. Inko and Mitsuki eventually returned late that night, tired, pissed and satisfied in equal measure. Toga's bastard parents had been bum-rushed into an agreement where they would allow her to collect her things from their home, continue to pay for her education until she graduated, and in return after she had her stuff, they were getting a restraining order against their violently psychotic daughter. It had been a close thing, but Inko had stopped her best friend from grabbing her daughter and blowing the Toga home to pieces. After settling Himiko in his mom's room for the night, Izuku lay in bed, ostensibly comfortable but with an uncomfortable fury burning in his chest and keeping him awake. He rolled over several times, grumbling to himself, but nothing settled him for hours. Then his door opened. He could only make out the silhouette in the dark of the night, but he knew who it was. She shuffled up to the head of his bed, clad in some of his mom's old pajamas. Izuku, you awake? Wordlessly, he held his covers open and she slid inside, her slim back pressing against his chest as she spooned against him. Couldn't sleep. She hummed, your mom's nice, but I don't feel as comfortable with her. Okay. He settled the covers around them, draping an arm around her stomach. It was easy to ignore whatever embarrassment he felt. His best friend needed comforting, and he did too. They lay there, sleep creeping up on them, when she spoke again. Izuku, will you help me? I want to become one of the greatest heroines ever, just so I can grind that in their faces until they beg for forgiveness. Will you teach me how? I will. She sighed and relaxed. That's not a bad reason to be a hero, is it? As long as it's secondary. Hell no. Ellipsis. There's another saying. No man is an island. No one gets through life alone, deprived of companionship. No one pillar can support any structure forever, not by itself. To remain alone, forever set aside, forever singularly admired or reviled is a cursed fate. But 2 pillars. That's a good start. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel for more contents like this and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you next time.